Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. What secrets remain hidden in the places we pass by every day? The old bookstore stood on the corner of Maple and Elm for as long as I could remember. I'd walked past it hundreds of times, barely giving it a second glance. But today, something was different. Perhaps it was the way the late afternoon light cast unusual shadows through the dusty display window, or how the faded sign above the door seemed to call to me specifically. My name is Thomas Everett, and until that moment, I considered myself a practical man. 38 years of life had taught me to trust what I could see and touch, to question coincidences, and to find logical explanations for the inexplicable. As a history professor at the local university, I prided myself on my analytical mind and methodical approach to mysteries, just not the kind I was about to encounter. I pushed open the door, triggering a bell that announced my presence with a harsh, discordant jingle that seemed to hang in the air a moment too long. The smell hit me immediately: old paper, leather bindings, and underneath it all, something else. Something slightly metallic and vaguely familiar that I couldn't quite place. "Can I help you find something specific?" The voice startled me. An elderly man with wire-rimmed glasses perched on a prominent nose materialized from between two towering shelves. His eyes, magnified by thick lenses, seemed unnaturally large as they studied me with uncomfortable intensity. "Just browsing," I replied, noticing how my voice sounded different in this space, muffled, as though the books were absorbing the sound. "I teach history at Riverview University. Always on the lookout for interesting volumes." "A historian?" He nodded slowly, still watching me. "Then perhaps you'd appreciate our backroom collection. Items with historical significance." There was something in his tone that made me hesitate, but curiosity won out. I followed him through a narrow passage between shelves that seemed to bend inward slightly, as if trying to touch each other across the aisle. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, but oddly made no sound under his. The back room was smaller than I expected, dimly lit by a single hanging bulb that created more shadows than illumination. Glass display cases contained various antiques, fountain pens, pocket watches, small sculptures, but the proprietor led me directly to a case in the corner. I've been waiting for someone with the right perspective. He unlocked the case with a key from a chain around his neck and removed a small wooden box. This arrived last week from an estate liquidation in Dresden. The previous owner was found dead under peculiar circumstances. Something cold slithered down my spine at his words, but I maintained my composure. He placed the box on a small table and opened it with reverent care. Inside, resting on faded velvet, lay a key. Not particularly large or ornate, just tarnished brass with an unusual tooth pattern and a handle formed in the shape of what might have been a stylized animal or perhaps a deformed human figure. "May I?" I asked, reaching toward it. "By all means." The old man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "It seems to be drawn to you." I nearly pulled my hand back at those words, but instead picked up the key. It was unexpectedly heavy and cold, so cold it almost burned against my palm. For just a moment, I thought I felt it pulse, like something alive. "What does it open?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady as an inexplicable sense of dread began to build in my chest. "That's the question, isn't it?" The shopkeeper's voice had dropped to a whisper. The previous owners never discovered its purpose. Perhaps you will. I should have put it back. Every instinct was screaming at me to return it to its box, to walk out of the store, to forget I'd ever seen it. Instead, I heard myself asking, how much? For you? The old man closed the box, leaving the key in my palm. Consider it a professional courtesy. One historian to another. I believe it belongs with you now. As I left the store with the key in my pocket, I couldn't shake the feeling that the weight against my thigh was more significant than the small piece of metal warranted. Outside, the sky had darkened considerably, but my watch showed it was barely past 4. The street looked different somehow, the buildings more angular, the shadows deeper, the few pedestrians moving with strange, jerky motions. I hurried home, constantly checking over my shoulder, unable to dismiss the sensation that I was being followed. Not by someone, but by something, a presence just beyond the edge of my vision, disappearing whenever I turned to look. My apartment welcomed me with familiar comfort, books lining the walls, the smell of this morning's coffee still lingering, the soft ticking of my grandfather's clock on the mantel. I placed the key on my desk and examined it under the bright lamp. The metal gleamed dully, revealing intricate patterns I hadn't noticed in the shop, tiny symbols etched into the surface that resembled no language I recognized. As I turned it over in my hands, studying the markings, the lamp flickered briefly. Did something just move in the corner of the room? I jerked my head up, heart suddenly racing, but saw only my own bookshelf. Returning my attention to the key, I noticed a small smudge on my finger where I touched one of the symbols. Not dirt, but a dark, reddish-brown stain that looked disturbingly like dried blood. As I reached for a tissue to wipe it off, the sound of scratching came from somewhere in my apartment, faint but unmistakable, like fingernails dragging slowly across wood. Hello? I called out, feeling foolish even as I did so. I lived alone, and my door had been locked. The scratching stopped immediately, replaced by silence so complete it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Then, the distinct sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor in the hallway outside my bedroom. My heart hammering against my ribs, I grabbed the nearest weapon-like object, a letter opener from my desk, and moved cautiously toward the sound. The hallway was dark, though I was certain I'd left the light on when I came home. Is someone there? My voice sounded thin and frightened, even to my own ears. No response, just the continuing silence that somehow seemed to be listening back at me. I reached for the light switch, flicked it up. Nothing happened. The darkness remained absolute, seeming to thicken with each passing second. And then, from the darkness, came a sound that froze my blood, a slow, wet inhalation, as if something was tasting the air. Tasting my fear. I stumbled backward toward my desk, fumbling for my phone to use as a flashlight. As the screen illuminated, casting a weak blue glow, I saw that the key was no longer where I'd left it. And somewhere in the darkness of my apartment, something was breathing that was not me. I spent that night huddled in the corner of my living room, the letter opener clutched in my sweating hand, waiting for dawn to break through the windows. The breathing sound had eventually stopped, or perhaps moved elsewhere, but I couldn't bring myself to search the apartment in the darkness. When morning finally came, pale sunlight filtering through the blinds, I found no evidence of an intruder, no footprints, no disturbed items, no broken locks. The key, however, was on the kitchen counter. I had not put it there. I called the university and, for the first time in 7 years of teaching, canceled my classes for the day. Something about the key demanded my attention, a compulsion I couldn't explain or resist. I needed to learn what it was, what it opened, and why it had come into my possession. The bookstore where I acquired it was my first destination, but when I arrived at the corner of Maple and Elm, I found only an empty storefront with a faded for lease sign in the window. The dust on the floor inside looked undisturbed for months, perhaps years. "Excuse me," I stopped an elderly woman walking her dog. "The bookstore that was here, do you know what happened to it?" She looked at me strangely. "Bookstore? There hasn't been any bookstore on this corner for at least 20 years. Used to be a hardware store until about 2008, then it's been empty since." I thanked her and walked away, my mind racing. Had I imagined yesterday's visit? But the key in my pocket was real, solid and cold against my leg. I pulled it out, examining it in the daylight. The symbols seemed to shift slightly as I turned it, almost as if they were rearranging themselves when not directly observed. My next stop was the university library. If anyone could help identify the key or its markings, it would be Elaine Woodward, the head of special collections and an expert in historical artifacts. "Thomas, you look terrible," she said as I entered her office. "Rough night?" "You could say that," I replied, not wanting to explain the inexplicable events. "I need your help with something." I placed the key on her desk, and Elaine's expression immediately changed from concern to fascination. She reached for a pair of white cotton gloves before touching it. "Extraordinary craftsmanship," she murmured, examining it under a magnifying glass. "These markings, they're unusual. Not quite runic, not hieroglyphics. Where did you get this?" I hesitated, then told her a half-truth. "An antique shop. The owner didn't know much about it." "I'm not surprised. This is, well, I need to do some research, but my initial impression is that it's quite old. Possibly medieval, though the design elements are inconsistent with typical European craftsmanship of that period." She looked up at me. "May I keep it for a few days to study it properly?" Every fiber of my being wanted to say yes, to be rid of the thing and whatever strangeness had followed it into my life. Yet something prevented me from agreeing, a possessiveness I didn't understand. "I'm sorry, I can't leave it. But perhaps we could look at it together?" Elaine seemed disappointed but nodded. "Let me scan these markings at least. I can cross-reference them with some databases." As she photographed the key from various angles, I felt a heaviness in the air, as if the atmospheric pressure had suddenly increased. The lights in her office dimmed momentarily, and her computer screen flickered. "That's odd," she muttered, tapping her keyboard. "The files aren't saving properly." A high-pitched whine emanated from her computer, growing louder until it became painful to hear. Then, with a pop and the smell of burning plastic, her screen went black. "What on earth?" Elaine pushed back from her desk as thin wisps of smoke rose from the computer tower. I pocketed the key quickly. "I'm sorry, I should go. Technical issues and all that." My words sounded hollow even to me. As I hurried from her office, I heard her calling after me, but I didn't stop. In the hallway, students moved past me in slow motion, their faces blurred and indistinct. The exit seemed much farther away than I remembered, the corridor stretching impossibly long before me. Once outside, I gulped fresh air, trying to calm my racing heart. This was madness. I was a rational man, a historian who dealt in facts and evidence, not supernatural phenomena. Yet I couldn't deny what was happening around me since the key had come into my possession. I needed more information, and I knew where I might find it. The university archives housed an extensive collection of occult and esoteric texts, resources I had previously dismissed as historical curiosities rather than sources of practical knowledge. The archives were located in the basement of the history building, a labyrinthine space of metal shelving and climate-controlled rooms. As I descended the stairs, the temperature dropped noticeably, my breath visible in small clouds before me. It was early October, but the chill felt like deep winter. Professor Everett, this is unexpected. Dr. Raymond Morris, the archivist, peered at me over his reading glasses. You're usually more interested in our military history collection than, he gestured to the shelves surrounding us, these obscurities. Research for a new course, I lied, surprised at how easily the deception came. Superstition and folklore in historical contexts. He seemed skeptical but led me to a section marked Occult Studies, European, Medieval to Renaissance. Let me know if you need assistance finding anything specific. Once alone among the shelves, I began pulling volumes at random, symbolism and alchemical traditions, esoteric artifacts of the Middle Ages, keys and locks, the metaphysics of barriers. Hours passed as I searched for anything resembling the markings on my key. The archives had no windows, so I didn't notice when day turned to evening. Only when the overhead lights automatically dimmed did I realize how late it had grown. The building would be nearly empty now, most professors and students long gone. I was about to give up when a thin volume caught my attention, Thresholds Unseen, Portals Between Worlds in European Mythology. The book fell open to a page with an illustration that made my blood freeze, a key nearly identical to mine, the same strange tooth pattern, the same twisted figure forming the handle. The text beside it was in Latin, which I could read with reasonable proficiency. The Key of Thorn, so named for its creator, the alchemist Edward Thorne, who in his quest to access realms beyond our own, crafted this abomination against nature. Those who have possessed it report visitations from entities that exist in the spaces between worlds, drawn by the key's power. Thorne himself vanished in 1473, the witnesses claim to have heard his voice emanating from solid walls for years afterward. My hands trembled as I turned the page, finding more. The key opens no physical lock, but rather weakens the barriers between our world and what lies beyond. Each use deteriorates these barriers further, allowing those who watch to extend their influence. The symbols inscribed upon it are in the language of beings not meant for human comprehension, and study of them has driven scholars to madness. A noise from behind the shelves interrupted my reading, a soft thud, like a book falling to the floor. Dr. Morris? I called out, but received no answer. I stood, my joints stiff from sitting too long, and moved cautiously around the shelf. The aisle was empty, but on the floor lay an open book I hadn't pulled from the shelves. Its pages were flipping rapidly, as if caught in a strong breeze, though the air was completely still. As I stared, the pages stopped turning abruptly. In the margin of the displayed page, something impossible was happening. Ink was forming into words, appearing letter by letter as if an invisible hand were writing. "We see you, Thomas." I backed away, bumping into the shelf behind me, sending several books tumbling to the floor. The thud they made seemed abnormally loud in the silence, echoing through the archives. And then, from every direction at once, came the sound of pages turning, hundreds of them, thousands, a dry rustling like insect wings that grew in volume until it was all I could hear. I ran, navigating the maze of shelves by memory, the book about Thorne's Keep clutched to my chest. Behind me, the rustling changed to a sound like paper tearing, violent and angry. The exit door seemed miles away, the distance expanding with each step I took. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but fear drove me forward. Finally reaching the door, I yanked it open and burst into the stairwell, slamming it shut behind me. Through the small window in the door, I could see the archives now in complete darkness, though I knew the motion-activated lights should have been on. Something moved in that darkness, a shifting mass that seemed made of shadows and torn paper, flowing like liquid across the floor toward the door. I didn't wait to see more. Taking the stairs two at a time, I emerged into the main hallway of the history building, nearly colliding with the night janitor. "Whoa there, Professor. What's the rush?" He steadied me with a hand on my shoulder. "Sorry, I looked back toward the stairwell door, expecting to see some horror emerging, but there was nothing. Lost track of time in the archives. Need to get home." Outside, the campus was deserted, street lamps casting pools of yellow light that seemed to push back against the encroaching darkness rather than illuminate it. The key in my pocket felt heavier than before and warmer, as if it had absorbed heat from my body. The book I'd taken might hold answers, might explain what was happening to me and how to stop it. But as I looked down at it under a street lamp, my hopes crumbled. Every page was now blank, the text and illustrations completely vanished, as if they had never existed. Only on the last page was there anything remaining, the same words I had seen for me in the archives, now burned into the paper as if branded there. "We see you, Thomas." And below that, in smaller script, "We are coming." Sleep eluded me that night, despite my exhaustion. Every creak of my apartment building, every distant siren or car horn made me jolt upright, straining to listen for sounds that didn't belong to the normal urban nightscape. The key lay on my coffee table where I could watch it, unwilling to let it out of my sight, yet equally unwilling to touch it. The book remained blank, no matter how many times I flipped through it, hoping to find even a fragment of the text I'd seen in the archives. Only those final, threatening words remained, scorched into the last page like a promise. By dawn, I had made a decision. If I couldn't research the key through conventional means, I would need to find someone with different expertise, someone who dealt in knowledge that existed outside academic circles. I remembered a conversation from months ago at a faculty mixer. Professor Irene Chambers from the anthropology department had mentioned researching folk practices and alternative belief systems in New England communities. At the time, I had nodded politely while privately dismissing her work as the study of superstition. Now, that knowledge seemed like my only hope. I found her in her office, walls covered with masks from various cultures and shelves lined with strange artifacts, bundles of dried herbs, small carvings, and what appeared to be animal bones arranged in patterns. "Thomas." She seemed genuinely pleased to see me. What brings a hard-nosed historical materialist to my humble domain of the irrational? Her teasing tone might have annoyed me days ago. Now, I barely registered it. "I need your help, Irene. Your expertise." I hesitated, then decided on honesty. "Something is happening to me that I can't explain." Her smile faded as she studied my face. "You look terrible. When did you last sleep?" "That's not important. What's important is this." I placed the key on her desk, careful not to touch it directly. Her reaction was immediate and alarming. She pushed her chair back, putting distance between herself and the object, her face draining of color. "Where did you get that?" Her voice had dropped to a whisper. I explained everything, the bookstore that shouldn't exist, the strange occurrences in my apartment, the research in the archives, the book that had emptied itself of text. As I spoke, she became increasingly agitated, finally standing and pacing the small confines of her office. "I've seen something like this before," she said when I finished. "Not this exact key, but objects that open things. Doorways. Connections. She rubbed her arms as if suddenly cold. During my fieldwork in Vermont, I documented a case involving a music box that supposedly opened a passage to somewhere else when played. 3 people went missing before the box was destroyed. How do I destroy this? I asked, gesturing to the key. I don't know if you can. Or should. She stopped pacing and looked at me intently. These objects have purposes. Destroying them without understanding those purposes can sometimes make things worse. Worse than having something watching me from the darkness? Writing messages to me in books? Potentially, yes. She sat down again, though still keeping her distance from the key. Thomas, what you've described, the entities becoming aware of you, suggests a connection has already formed. Breaking that connection improperly could have consequences. What kind of consequences? She didn't answer directly. I know someone who might be able to help. She's not an academic, but she has experience with these matters. That afternoon found us driving to a small house on the outskirts of town in a neighborhood where the properties were spaced far apart, surrounded by trees that were now displaying their autumn colors. The house itself was unremarkable, a modest 2-story structure with peeling blue paint and a garden that had seen better days. The woman who answered the door was equally unassuming, middle-aged, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt. Only her eyes hinted at something unusual, pale, almost colorless, and unnervingly steady as they assessed me. Eleanor, this is Thomas Everett, the colleague I called about, Irene said. Thomas, Eleanor Whitman. Come in, Eleanor said, her voice deeper than I expected. And please tell me you haven't brought the object into my home. I patted my jacket pocket. I couldn't leave it. She frowned but stepped aside to let us enter. The interior of the house was cluttered but clean, every surface covered with books, small sculptures, dried plants hanging from the ceiling, and glass jars filled with unidentifiable substances. Sit, she directed, pointing to a worn sofa. And keep that thing in your pocket for now. As Irene explained my situation, Eleanor listened without interruption, occasionally nodding as if confirming something she already knew. When Irene finished, Eleanor turned to me. Show me your hands. Confused, I extended both hands, palms up. She took them in hers, examining them carefully, running her thumbs over my fingertips in a way that made me want to pull away. You've touched it directly. Skin to metal. It wasn't a question. Yes, of course. How else would I? Bad idea, she interrupted. Very bad idea. Direct contact accelerates the connection. She released my hands and stood. Wait here. She disappeared into another room, returning moments later with a small wooden box lined with what looked like lead and a pair of thick gloves. Put the key in here, using the gloves. Don't touch it directly again. I did as instructed, feeling a strange reluctance as I dropped the key into the lined box. As soon as the lid closed, I felt a pressure I hadn't realized was present suddenly release, like stepping from humid air into an air-conditioned room. Better? Eleanor asked, watching me closely. I nodded, surprised at how much clearer my mind felt. What is this box? Lead-lined, blessed by 3 different faith traditions, and inscribed with protective symbols from half a dozen others, she said matter-of-factly. It won't contain whatever's connected to the key forever, but it will slow things down while we figure out what to do. What exactly is connected to it? I asked. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Irene. That's what we need to find out. From your experiences, it sounds like entities that exist in what some traditions call the in-between spaces, not quite our reality, not quite somewhere else. Liminality is a concept found in many cultures, Irene added, slipping into her professor mode. Thresholds, doorways, crossroads, places that are neither here nor there, where the boundaries between worlds grow thin. And this key, it opens these boundaries? I asked. Not exactly, Eleanor said. At least, I don't think so. From what you've described, it's more like a beacon. It draws attention from the other side, makes them aware of you. She tapped the box. The real question is why this came to you specifically. I don't know, I admitted. The shopkeeper said it seemed drawn to me, but that doesn't make sense. Actually, it might, Eleanor said thoughtfully. Objects like these often find their way to people who can serve their purpose. Have you experienced loss recently? A death, perhaps? Something that might have made you more receptive? The question hit me like a physical blow. My wife, I said quietly. Caroline. 2 years ago. Cancer. Understanding dawned in Eleanor's eyes. Grief creates openings in us. Spaces that weren't there before. These entities, they can sense those spaces. You think they're targeting me because I'm grieving? I think the key found you because your loss created a resonance it could connect with, she corrected. Whether that's by design or coincidence is another question entirely. She opened a large, ancient-looking book on her coffee table, flipping through pages covered in diagrams and text in languages I didn't recognize. We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with before we can address it properly. That means learning more about this key, its history, and what it was designed to do. She looked up at me. And we need to do it quickly. The longer the connection exists, the stronger it becomes. The book I found in the archives, I began, is now useless, she finished for me. They erased it. They don't want you to have that knowledge. They can do that? Influence the physical world? To some extent, yes, especially with written information about themselves. Their ability to affect our reality is limited, but growing stronger through their connection to you. A chill ran through me. What happens if the connection becomes too strong? Eleanor's gaze was direct and unflinching. Best case scenario? They use you as a conduit to enter our world more fully, probably driving you insane in the process. Worst case? They manage to create a permanent opening, allowing more of their kind through. And what are their kind, exactly? That depends on which belief system you subscribe to, Irene interjected. Demons, jinn, fae, yokai, every culture has names for entities that exist at the edges of our reality, pushing to get in. I don't care what they're called, I said, frustration building. I just want to know how to stop them. We start with research, Eleanor said firmly. I have resources Irene doesn't have access to. Books and journals from collectors and practitioners who deal with these phenomena. She stood and moved to a cabinet, removing an old leather journal. This belonged to a colleague who specialized in threshold objects, items that connect our world with others. There might be information about your key or something similar. As she opened the journal, the lights in the room flickered. All three of us froze, looking up at the ceiling fixture. That's just a power surge, I said, not believing it myself. A low hum began to emanate from the wooden box containing the key, growing in intensity until it vibrated against the table surface. Eleanor quickly placed her hand on the lid, muttering words in a language I didn't understand. The humming stopped abruptly, but a new sound replaced it, a faint scratching from the walls, as if something was moving inside them. "They've followed you here," Eleanor said, her voice tight with controlled fear. "The connection is stronger than I thought." The scratching grew louder, moving across the ceiling and down the walls. Small objects on the shelves began to tremble and fall, books flipped open on their own, pages turning rapidly. "What do we do?" I asked, standing and moving closer to Irene, who looked as terrified as I felt. Eleanor was already in motion, grabbing jars and packets from her shelves. "We need to reinforce the boundaries, create a circle of protection while we figure this out." She handed us chalk and small bags of what looked like herbs. "Draw a continuous circle around us, all three of us in the table with the box. Don't break the line." "Irene, place pinches of this mixture at the cardinal points of the circle once it's drawn." As we worked frantically, the disturbances intensified. The temperature in the room plummeted, our breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. The scratching in the walls was now a tearing sound, as if something was ripping through the plaster and wood. "Hurry!" Eleanor urged as she placed candles at intervals around our nearly completed circle. Just as I connected my chalk line with Irene's, completing the circle, the lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness save for the glow of Eleanor's hastily lit candles. In that dim, flickering light, I saw movement in the corners of the room, shadows flowing like liquid, gathering in pools of darkness too deep to be natural. From those depths came sounds that human throats could never produce, clicks and hisses and wet, sliding noises. "Don't look directly at them," Eleanor warned, lighting the last candle. "And don't step outside the circle, no matter what you see or hear." As if triggered by her words, a voice called my name, not from the shadows, but from behind me, inside our protective circle. "Thomas?" I knew that voice. 2 years of grief had not dimmed my memory of its cadence, its unique timbre. I turned slowly, already knowing what I would see, unprepared for the reality of it. Caroline stood within our circle, looking exactly as she had before the illness took her, healthy, vibrant, her eyes bright with the intelligence and warmth I had fallen in love with 20 years ago. "Thomas, why did you leave me alone in the darkness for so long?" she asked, her voice breaking with hurt. I took an involuntary step toward her before Eleanor's iron grip on my arm stopped me. "That is not your wife," she hissed in my ear. "Don't listen. Don't engage." But Caroline, or the thing wearing her face, stepped closer, her expression pleading. "I've been waiting for you to find the key, to open the way. I'm trapped between worlds, Thomas. You can bring me back." Every fiber of my being wanted to believe her, to take her in my arms, to reclaim what death had stolen from me. My grief, never fully processed, roared back with overwhelming force. "The key connects the worlds," Caroline continued, reaching out toward me. "Use it, and we can be together again." Eleanor's grip on my arm tightened painfully. "It's using your memories, your emotions. This is how they break through. They find what you want most and use it against you." The thing wearing Caroline's face turned to Eleanor, its expression changing from pleading to rage in an instant. "Silence," it commanded, in a voice that was no longer Caroline's but something ancient and inhuman. "This is not your concern, seer." The candles flared suddenly, their flames shooting upward before guttering low. The shadows beyond our circle surged forward, pressing against the invisible barrier created by Eleanor's protective measures. "They're testing the boundaries," Irene whispered, her academic detachment completely gone, replaced by naked fear. Thomas, the entity said, its voice shifting between Caroline's familiar tones and something else, something that made my skin crawl. Take the key. Use it. Free me. My hand moved toward the box almost of its own accord, drawn by a compulsion that bypassed rational thought. Eleanor slapped my hand away. If you open that box now, we're all dead, she said bluntly. That thing is not your wife. It never was. It's using her image, her voice, because that's what will make you lower your defenses. The entity that was not Caroline snarled, its face briefly distorting into something inhuman before settling back into my wife's beloved features. She's lying to you, it said. She wants to keep us apart. She's jealous of what we had. What we had ended when Caroline died, I said, finding my voice at last. And Caroline would never ask me to endanger others. Something changed in the entity's eyes, a flicker of recognition that I had seen through its deception. It stepped back, its form becoming less solid, more like smoke given temporary shape. You will open the way eventually, Thomas Everett, it said, its voice now a chorus of discordant whispers. The key has chosen you. The connection is made. We are patient. We have waited centuries. We can wait a little longer. With those words, the apparition dissolved into mist that was quickly absorbed by the shadows surrounding our circle. The temperature in the room began to rise, the oppressive pressure lifting. Is it gone? Irene asked after several minutes of silence. Not gone, Eleanor said grimly. Just retreating. For now. She looked at me with new concern. The connection is stronger than I feared. They were able to manifest physically within a protective circle. That should not have been possible. What does that mean for me? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. It means we need to work quickly, she replied. The barrier between you and them is wearing thin. Soon, they won't need the key anymore to reach you, you'll be key enough. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across Eleanor's garden. Within hours, night would fall, and with darkness, I knew they would return, stronger than before. Whatever answers we needed had to be found before then. My time was running out. Eleanor worked frantically, consulting one ancient text after another while Irene assisted, translating passages in languages I didn't recognize. I sat uselessly nearby, unable to help with their esoteric research, feeling like a ticking bomb in their midst. The wooden box containing the key remained at the center of a protective circle, occasionally emitting a faint hum or vibration that set my teeth on edge. Each time it happened, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to pulse in response. Here, Eleanor finally said, jabbing her finger at a page in a weather-beaten journal bound in what looked disturbingly like human skin. Edward Thorne's personal diary. A colleague acquired it from a private collector in Prague. How did you get this? I asked, moving closer to see. Better you don't know, she replied grimly. What matters is what it tells us. Irene adjusted her glasses, peering at the cramped, archaic handwriting. It's in early modern English. Difficult to decipher, but readable. Eleanor turned the book so I could see the pages. Diagrams covered the margins, concentric circles, strange geometric patterns, and drawings of what appeared to be the key, shown from different angles with annotations around it. According to this, Irene said, scanning the text, Thorne was obsessed with the concept of parallel worlds, places that exist alongside our own, separated by what he called the veil. He believed these worlds contained knowledge and power beyond human comprehension. The key was his attempt to pierce this veil, Eleanor continued. Not to open a physical door, but to create a connection, a bridge between our world and these others. Did he succeed? I asked. Their exchanged glance told me the answer before they spoke. Yes, Irene said quietly, but not in the way he intended. Listen to this passage. The key works. God help me, it works. But what comes through is not what I sought. They are aware. They see. They hunger. I have opened a window when I meant only to peek through a keyhole. A chill ran through me at those words. That's exactly what's happening to me. Eleanor nodded. Thorn created something he couldn't control. The key doesn't just connect to one specific place or entity, it broadcasts to all of them like a beacon across the void. And once they notice you, they start trying to come through. I finished. Exactly. And the more attention you pay to them, the stronger the connection becomes. Fear, fascination, even academic curiosity, all of it strengthens their ability to reach across. So what happened to Thorn? I asked, dreading the answer. Irene flipped forward several pages. His entries become increasingly disjointed. He describes seeing things in mirrors, hearing voices from empty rooms. Then this, dated June 17, 1473, they are in the walls now. In the floors. In the spaces between breaths. I cannot escape them even in sleep. They were familiar faces to torment me. Last night, my long-dead mother sat at my bedside, but her eyes, God preserve me, her eyes were not her own. The parallels to my own experiences made my stomach clench. And then, one final entry, Irene said, turning to the last page with writing. I have found a way to end this. Not destruction, they will not allow the key to be destroyed, but banishment. There is a place where the veil is naturally thin, where the key's power can be neutralized by greater forces. By the time this is read, I will have taken the key there and sealed it away forever. May God forgive my arrogance. That's it? I asked. He doesn't say where this place is? No, Eleanor said, frustration evident in her voice. The specific location is missing. But he must have written it somewhere, some clue. She began examining the book more carefully, tilting it under the light, feeling along the binding. Many alchemists and occultists hid their most important secrets in their texts, invisible ink, coded messages, hidden compartments. As she manipulated the book, a small slip of paper fell from between the pages, yellowed with age and covered in faded writing. Irene snatched it up, her eyes widening as she read. Coordinates, she breathed. And a name, the Convergence. Eleanor took the paper, her expression shifting from excitement to concern. I know this place. It's about 40 miles north of here, deep in the forest. Local legends call it the Witch's Clearing, a place where compasses spin and electronics fail. A natural thin spot in the veil, Irene murmured. Just as Thorn described. So we take the key there and, what? Bury it? Throw it away? I asked. No, Eleanor said firmly. If Thorn's account is accurate, there's a specific ritual that must be performed, a way of neutralizing the key's connection to these entities without destroying the key itself, which they would prevent. Does he describe this ritual? Eleanor flipped back through the journal, searching. Here, fragments only. He references the binding words and the circle of containment, but doesn't provide details. She looked up, her expression grave. We'll have to improvise based on what we know of similar containment rituals. Is that safe? I asked. Safer than doing nothing, she replied bluntly. These entities are growing stronger by the hour. If we wait too long, they'll be able to fully manifest without the key's help, using you as their conduit. Outside, the last light of day had faded. Night pressed against the windows, darker than it should have been, as if the shadows beyond our circle were affecting the natural world as well. We need to go now, Eleanor said, gathering supplies into a bag, candles, chalk, small jars of various substances, the journal. The clearing is difficult to find in daylight. In darkness, it will be nearly impossible without guidance. Guidance? I echoed. I know someone who lives near there. A tracker who understands the forest's peculiarities. As Eleanor prepared, the disturbances around us intensified. The scratching in the walls returned, louder than before. Objects on shelves rattled and fell. The temperature fluctuated wildly, freezing one moment, stifling the next. They know what we're planning, Irene said, her voice tight with fear. They're trying to stop us. Eleanor quickly reinforced our protective circle with more herbs and symbols, but I could see strain on her face. The circle won't hold much longer. We need to leave while we still can. Using thick gloves, she carefully placed the box containing the key into a larger container lined with symbols similar to those around our circle. Even through this double containment, I could feel the key's presence, a persistent pressure at the edge of my consciousness. Stay close to me, Eleanor instructed as we prepared to break the circle. Don't look directly at the shadows. Don't respond if you hear voices. And whatever happens, don't let go of each other. We joined hands, Eleanor at the front, then me, then Irene, forming a human chain. Ready? Eleanor asked, her free hand holding a small bundle of smoking herbs. Why break the circle? Run directly for the front door. Don't stop for anything. Irene and I nodded, too frightened for words. Eleanor smudged part of the chalk line with her foot, immediately swinging the smoking herbs in wide arcs before us. Now! We ran, Eleanor pulling us forward through suddenly frigid air. The shadows around us exploded into motion, flowing across walls and floor like living ink, reaching tendrils toward us that dissipated when they touched the smoke from Eleanor's herbs. Voices called from the darkness, some pleading, some threatening, all using names and phrases designed to make us hesitate. I heard Caroline again, begging me not to leave her. Irene gasped as a voice addressed her in terms that seemed equally personal. Ignore them, Eleanor shouted as we reached the front door. She flung it open, and we burst out into the night. The darkness outside was almost solid, the stars and moon obscured by unnatural clouds that swirled directly above Eleanor's house. The wind had picked up, carrying whispers that made no sense yet somehow conveyed malevolence. Eleanor's car sat in the driveway, an old station wagon that had seen better days. We piled in, Eleanor thrusting the container with the key into my hands while she started the engine. Hold this, she instructed. Keep it on your lap, not touching your body directly. And whatever you do, don't open it. The engine sputtered reluctantly to life. As we backed out of the driveway, I looked back at the house. What I saw made my blood freeze, every window blazed with light that we had left in darkness. Silhouettes moved behind the glass, dozens of them, shapes that only approximated human form. Don't look, Irene warned, seeing the direction of my gaze. It only makes the connection stronger. I forced myself to face forward as Eleanor drove, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. The headlights seemed barely able to penetrate the unnatural darkness before us, illuminating only a few feet of road at a time. The clearing is about an hour's drive from here, she said, assuming the roads remain cooperative. What does that mean? I asked. It means these entities can influence physical reality to some extent, she replied grimly. Especially near thin spots in the veil. Roads can seem to shift, landmarks disappear, distances expand. Like the hallway at the university, I murmured, remembering how impossibly long it had seemed as I fled Elaine's office. Exactly. They distort perception first, then reality itself if the connection is strong enough. We drove in tense silence, the container on my lap occasionally humming or vibrating. Each time, the headlights would dim momentarily, and shapes would seem to flit across the road ahead, there and gone too quickly to identify. After about 20 minutes, Eleanor turned onto a narrow, unpaved road that wound into the forest. The trees pressed close on either side, their branches forming a tunnel that seemed to swallow the car's meager light. "We'll need to stop ahead," Eleanor said. "My contact lives just off this road. He'll guide us the rest of the way." As she spoke, the engine sputtered and died, plunging us into darkness and silence. Eleanor tried the ignition repeatedly, but the car remained dead. "Electronics failure," Irene whispered. "Like you mentioned earlier." "We're still miles from the clearing," Eleanor said, her voice tight. "This shouldn't be happening yet." A tapping sound made us all jump, knuckles rapping against Eleanor's window. A beam of light illuminated a weathered face peering in at us, deep-set eyes squinting against the glare of his own flashlight. Eleanor sighed with relief. "It's him." She rolled down her window. "James. We were just coming to find you." The man, James, nodded grimly. "I know." Felt the disturbance from my cabin. Haven't seen one this strong in years. His gaze fixed on the container in my lap. "That it?" "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "We need to reach the convergence. Tonight." James's expression grew even more serious. "Bad timing. Moon's dark. The forest is active. But we don't have a choice, do we?" "No," I said, speaking for the first time since we left the house. "We don't." James nodded once. "Leave the car. Bring only what you need for the ritual. The path to the clearing isn't meant for carrying burdens." We gathered our supplies, Eleanor's bag of ritual items, the all-important container with the key, and flashlights that James provided, warning that they might not work reliably as we got closer to our destination. The forest path was narrow and winding, barely visible even with the flashlights. James led the way, moving with the confidence of someone who knew every root and stone by heart. Eleanor followed, then me, with Irene bringing up the rear. "Stay close," James called back to us. "The forest has its own ideas tonight. Step where I step." I soon understood his warning. The path seemed to shift subtly when not directly observed, turning without reason or doubling back on itself. Several times I found myself walking toward a different member of our group, the path having somehow looped around while I wasn't paying attention. The sounds of the forest were wrong as well, too loud in some places, unnaturally silent in others. Occasionally I heard what seemed like distant conversations or laughter, though James assured us no one else lived for miles in any direction. "The veil thins as we get closer," he explained when I mentioned these sounds. "You're hearing fragments from the other side. Try not to listen too closely. They can pull you in that way." After what felt like hours of walking, the forest suddenly opened up before us, revealing a perfectly circular clearing about 50 feet in diameter. No trees grew within its boundaries, though the surrounding forest was dense and ancient. The ground was bare earth, without even weeds or moss covering it. Most striking was the absolute stillness. No wind moved the branches at the clearing's edge. No insects chirped. Even our footsteps seemed muted as we entered the space, as if sound itself was different here. The convergence, James said quietly. A place where worlds touch. In the center of the clearing stood a single stone about waist high, roughly cylindrical with a flat top surface. Strange markings covered its sides, symbols similar to those on the key, but older, more primal somehow. The binding stone, Eleanor whispered, approaching it reverently. This must be where Thorn performed his ritual. She set her bag down beside the stone and began removing items, candles, chalk, small pouches of herbs and powders. Working quickly but methodically, she drew a large circle around the stone, inscribing symbols at regular intervals along its circumference. "What can we do?" Irene asked. "Help me place these candles," Eleanor directed, handing us tall black candles. "At each symbol along the circle. Don't smudge the chalk lines." As we worked, I noticed James standing at the edge of the clearing, his expression tense as he scanned the surrounding forest. "Is something wrong?" I asked him. "They're gathering," he said without looking at me. "Can't you feel it?" Now that he mentioned it, I could. A pressure in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm breaks, but more focused, more intentional. The container in my hands vibrated continuously now, the key inside resonating with whatever forces were converging around us. "Hurry," James called to Eleanor. "We don't have much time." Eleanor nodded, working faster. "The ritual is simple in concept but difficult in execution," she explained as she completed the circle. "We need to sever the key's connection to these entities while simultaneously binding it to this place, a spot where the natural boundary between worlds is stronger than the key's ability to breach it." "And the key stays here?" I asked. "Forever," she confirmed. "In the stone. That's what the indentation on top is for, it's shaped to hold the key." I looked at the stone and indeed saw a small depression in its center, roughly the size and shape of the key. "We're ready," Eleanor announced, straightening up. "Thomas, bring the key to the stone, but don't remove it from the container yet." I stepped forward, the weight of the container suddenly seeming much greater than its actual mass. Each step toward the center of the circle required more effort than the last, as if I were walking against a strong current. "They're resisting," Eleanor said, noticing my struggle. "They don't want the key neutralized." From the forest around us came sounds that raised the hair on my neck, not animal calls or even the strange distant voices I'd heard earlier, but something more primal. Rhythmic clicking, low hums that seemed to vibrate in my bones rather than my ears, and occasional bursts of what sounded like static electricity. "Light the candles," Eleanor instructed Irene. "Clockwise, starting from the north point." As Irene moved around the circle lighting each candle, the resistance I felt lessened slightly, allowing me to reach the stone. I placed the container on its surface, next to the depression waiting for the key. "Now we begin," Eleanor said, opening Thorn's journal to a marked page. I've reconstructed the ritual as best I could from his notes and my own knowledge. James, Irene, stand at opposite sides of the circle. Thomas, remain at the stone. I'll recite the binding words. She began to speak in a language I didn't recognize, not Latin or Greek or any modern tongue, but something that sounded older, its syllables harsh and difficult for human mouths to form. As she spoke, the candles flared higher, their flames shifting from yellow-orange to a deep, unnatural blue. The vibration from the container intensified, and the air within the circle began to shimmer like heat waves rising from hot asphalt. Outside our circle, the darkness between the trees deepened, solidifying into moving shapes that paced the perimeter like predators seeking a way in. "Don't look at them," James warned sharply when he saw my gaze drifting toward the forest's edge. "Keep your eyes on the stone." Eleanor's chanting grew louder, more urgent. She moved to stand before me at the stone, her eyes fixed on the container. "Now," she said during a brief pause in the ritual words, "open the box and place the key in the depression. Quickly, but don't touch it directly. Use the gloves." My hand shook as I opened the outer container, then the lead-lined box within. The key lay inside, gleaming with an inner light that had nothing to do with the candles around us. For a moment, I felt an overwhelming urge to pick it up with my bare hands, to feel its weight and texture directly against my skin. "The gloves, Thomas," Irene reminded me sharply, seeing my hesitation. I pulled myself back from the brink, donning the thick gloves Eleanor had provided. Even through their protective layers, I could feel the key's unnatural warmth as I lifted it. Just as I positioned it above the depression in the stone, ready to place it, a voice called my name, Caroline's voice, but not from a single direction. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, inside my head and all around me simultaneously. "Thomas, please. If you do this, you'll trap me forever. I'll never find peace." My hand froze, the key suspended inches above its destination. "It's not her," Eleanor said firmly, never pausing in her ritual movements. "You know it's not her. It's trying to stop you, using your grief as a weapon." "Thomas," the voice continued, heavy with sorrow, "I've been trying to come back to you. The key is the only way. These people don't understand. They're keeping us apart." I hesitated, torn between what I knew logically and what my heart desperately wanted to believe. "Your wife is at peace," James said quietly from his position at the circle's edge. "I can sense these things. Whatever is speaking to you, it's not her. It never was." Anger replaced my uncertainty, anger at these entities for using Caroline's memory, for tainting the love we had shared with their deception. "You're not Caroline," I said aloud, my voice steady despite the tears that blurred my vision. "Caroline would never ask me to endanger others for her sake. She would never use my love as manipulation." With those words, I placed the key firmly into the depression in the stone. It fit perfectly, as if the stone had been carved specifically for it. The moment the key settled into place, everything changed. The air within the circle became charged with energy, the blue candle flames shooting upward in pillars of light. Eleanor's chanting reached a crescendo, the words seeming to take physical form as they left her mouth, glowing symbols that hung in the air momentarily before sinking into the stone around the key. Outside our circle, the entities abandoned all pretense of human form. The darkness between the trees coalesced into shapes that defied description, geometries that hurt the eye to look upon, limbs and appendages that bent in impossible ways, faces, if they could be called that, composed of holes and angles rather than features. They surged toward our circle, no longer content to pace its perimeter. Where they touched the boundary created by Eleanor's chalk and candles, they sizzled and recoiled, but kept coming, testing different points, looking for weakness. "Hold your positions," Eleanor shouted over the cacophony of inhuman sounds now emanating from the entities. "The binding is almost complete." The key in the stone began to sink, as if the rock were suddenly liquid. As it descended, the symbols Eleanor had conjured swirled around it, wrapping it in bands of light that tightened with each passing second. Then, without warning, a tendril of living shadow snaked under the chalk line at James's feet, a small breach, but enough. It shot across the ground toward me, faster than thought, wrapping around my ankle before anyone could react. Cold beyond anything I had ever felt seared through my leg as the tendril began pulling me toward the edge of the circle, toward the waiting darkness. I cried out, grabbing the stone for support, my feet sliding on the bare earth. The circle is broken. Irene screamed, pointing to where more tendrils were now slipping through the gap. Eleanor never hesitated. Snatching a handful of powder from one of her pouches, she flung it at the encroaching shadows while continuing her chant. Where the powder touched, the shadows hissed and recoiled, giving her precious seconds to repair the circle with fresh chalk. But the tendril around my ankle remained, still pulling, still burning with that unnatural cold. My fingers were slipping from the stone, my body being dragged inch by inexorable inch toward the boundary. Hold on. James was suddenly beside me, a knife in his hand. Before I could protest, he slashed at the shadow tendril, which released me with a sound like tearing fabric. Eleanor completed her chanting with a final, thunderous phrase that seemed to momentarily stop all other sound in the clearing. The key, now merely a glint of metal deep within the stone, flared with blinding light. For one terrible moment, everything was illuminated, the clearing, the surrounding forest, and the entities that lurked there. I saw them clearly, in all their impossible horror, and knew that the sight would haunt me for the rest of my life. Then darkness rushed in from all sides, not the hungry darkness of the entities, but natural night, cool and clean. The candles guttered and went out. The pressure in the air vanished, replaced by ordinary forest sounds, wind in the leaves, distant out calls, the rustle of small animals. We stood in stunned silence, unsure if it was truly over. Is it done? Irene finally whispered. Eleanor nodded slowly, her face exhausted but relieved. The key is bound. Its connection to them is severed. She looked at me. And your connection through it is broken as well. I realized she was right. The constant pressure I had felt at the edge of my consciousness since finding the key was gone. I felt lighter, clearer, as if a fog I hadn't recognized had finally lifted. What about them? I gestured toward the now ordinary darkness between the trees. Are they gone? Not gone, James said soberly. Never gone, but pushed back behind the veil where they belong, and without the key, they have no easy way to reach through again. At least not here, Eleanor added. There are other thin spots, other objects like the key. But this particular door is closed. We gathered our supplies in silence, the intensity of what we had experienced leaving us drained and introspective. As we prepared to leave the clearing, I turned back for one last look at the stone. No trace of the key was visible now, just smooth rock with ancient symbols carved into its surface. Will it stay there forever? I asked Eleanor. As long as the stone stands, she replied, which, from its weathering, has been thousands of years already. As we followed James back through the forest, the path now straight and clear in the light of ordinary flashlights, I felt both loss and relief intermingled. Caroline was truly gone, the brief, false hope that the entities had offered exposed as the cruel manipulation it always was. Yet in confronting this truth, in refusing their temptation, I had perhaps taken the first real step toward healing. The forest around us was just a forest now, ancient and primeval, yes, but natural in its mysteries. Whatever lurked beyond the veil would remain there, at least for now. But as we emerged from the tree lane and saw Eleanor's car waiting where we had left it, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had glimpsed something I was never meant to see, that some knowledge, once gained, can never be completely forgotten. And somewhere, in the spaces between heartbeats, in the shadows between blinks, they were still watching. waiting for another key, another door, another grief-stricken soul willing to believe the impossible for the chance to reclaim what was lost. Their patience was infinite, and there were always more keys to be found. 3 months passed. Winter settled over the city, transforming the university campus into a postcard scene of snow-draped buildings and ice-trimmed trees. Life had returned to something resembling normalcy. I taught my classes, attended faculty meetings, and worked on my long-neglected research. Yet nothing was truly the same. How could it be, after what I had seen? After what I now knew existed just beyond the thin membrane of reality we all take for granted? I had maintained contact with Eleanor and Irene, the shared experience creating a bond that transcended our different worldviews. Once a week, we met for coffee, ostensibly to discuss academic matters, but really to reassure ourselves and each other that we weren't going mad, that what we had experienced was real. James remained in his cabin in the forest, but occasionally sent cryptic messages through Eleanor, warnings about unusual activity near the convergence or strange reports from nearby towns. The entities hadn't given up entirely, it seemed, though their ability to influence our world had been significantly diminished without the key. On this particular December evening, I sat alone in my office, grading end-of-semester papers as darkness gathered outside my window. The campus had emptied for the day, most students and faculty having headed home early to avoid the snowstorm forecasted for later. The building creaked and settled around me, its aging infrastructure protesting against the winter cold. A knock at my door startled me from my concentration. "Come in," I called, expecting perhaps a desperate student seeking last-minute assignment guidance. The door opened to reveal Elaine Woodward, the head of special collections who had first examined the key for me all those months ago. I hadn't spoken with her since that day when her computer had mysteriously malfunctioned. "Thomas," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course, Elaine. What can I do for you?" She closed the door behind her and sat in the chair opposite my desk, studying me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "You've changed," she said finally, "since that day you brought me the key." I carefully set down my pen. "Changed how?" "You're more cautious, more observant." She tilted her head slightly. "Your research focus has shifted too. I noticed you've been requesting materials on folklore and comparative mythology, not your usual military history." "Just expanding my horizons," I replied lightly. "Interdisciplinary perspectives and all that." She nodded, clearly not believing me but not pressing the issue either. From her bag, she withdrew a small, cloth-wrapped bundle and placed it on my desk between us. "I found this yesterday while cataloging a recent acquisition, a collection of personal effects from a Professor Hargrove who died last month. It was hidden in a false bottom of his desk drawer." With a sense of foreboding, I unwrapped the cloth. Inside lay a small brass object, not a key, but a coin or medallion covered with markings similar to those I had seen on the key. My blood ran cold at the sight. "You recognize the symbols," Elaine said. It wasn't a question. I chose my words carefully. "They look like something I saw once, yes." "Thomas," she leaned forward, her voice dropping to just above a whisper, "that day when my computer failed, it wasn't a coincidence, was it? Something happened. Something connected to that key you showed me." For a moment, I considered denying it, maintaining the comfortable fiction that the world was exactly as simple and explainable as we pretend it is. But Elaine's direct gaze held a knowledge that went beyond academic curiosity. She had glimpsed something too, however briefly. "No," I admitted. "It wasn't a coincidence." She nodded, as if confirming something she already knew. Hargrove was researching threshold artifacts, objects that supposedly connect other planes of existence. Most of his colleagues thought he was eccentric at best, delusional at worst. But he was methodical, thorough. She pushed the medallion slightly closer to me. This was with his research notes. He called it the Watcher's Eye, claimed it allowed the user to see things that exist just beyond normal perception. Why bring it to me? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Because something happened to you, she said simply. Something that changed you in ways most people wouldn't notice, but I did. And because Hargrove's last notes mention a key with markings like these. He was looking for it when he died. How did he die? I asked, dreading the answer. Officially? A stroke. But the medical examiner noted unusual circumstances. He was found in his locked office, all the mirrors shattered, with an expression of... She hesitated, extreme terror. The room suddenly felt colder, the shadows in the corners deeper. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall, visible in the pool of light cast by the campus street lamps. What do you want from me, Elaine? The truth, she said immediately. Whatever you know about these objects, about what happened to Hargrove. I've spent my career preserving knowledge. I need to understand this. I considered my options. I could lie, send her away with platitudes about academic speculation and folklore. But the medallion on my desk pulsed with the same subtle wrongness I had felt from the key. If she continued to investigate on her own, without understanding the dangers. It's not just knowledge, I said finally. It's not academic. These objects, they're dangerous in ways you can't imagine. Try me, she challenged. So I told her everything, the bookstore that shouldn't have existed, the manifestations in my apartment, the research that erased itself. I told her about Eleanor and the ritual at the Convergence, about the entities that hungered to break through into our world. Throughout my account, she listened without interruption, her expression shifting from skepticism to horrified belief. When I finished, she sat in silence for several long moments, processing what she had heard. Finally, she reached for the medallion, but I caught her wrist before she could touch it. Don't, I warned. Direct contact strengthens the connection. That's how it starts. She withdrew her hand slowly. What should we do with it? Contact Eleanor, I said. She'll know how to contain it properly until we can take it to the Convergence. Elaine nodded, then asked the question I had been dreading. These entities, are they still watching you? Before I could answer, the lights in my office flickered. Just once, just briefly, but enough to make both of us freeze. Not as much, I said carefully. The ritual broke the direct connection through the key. But once they know you exist, I let the implication hang in the air. They don't forget, she finished for me. No, they don't. Outside, the snow was falling more heavily now, the world beyond my window becoming a blur of white. We wrapped the medallion back in its cloth, Elaine being careful not to touch it directly. As she placed it in her bag, her hand trembled slightly, the first sign of fear she had shown. I'll contact Eleanor tonight, she said, standing to leave. I'll come with you, I offered. You shouldn't be alone with that thing, even contained. As we prepared to venture out into the storm, I found myself oddly calm despite the revelation of another threshold artifact. Perhaps it was the knowledge that I wasn't facing this alone anymore, that others understood the truth I had discovered. Or perhaps it was simply that, having glimpsed what lurked beyond the veil, nothing in this world seemed quite as frightening by comparison. Thomas, Elaine paused at the door, her expression troubled. If these objects keep appearing, if they're somehow finding their way to people, then the entities are still searching for a way through, I finished. The key was just one attempt. There will be others. How many, do you think? She asked. How many doors are waiting to be opened? I thought of Eleanor's words from months ago. There are other thin spots, other objects like the key. I don't know, I admitted, but I intend to find out. Knowledge is our best defense, understanding what these things are, where they come from, how to neutralize them before they can cause harm. A new research focus, she said with a grim smile. Not one the Tenga Committee would appreciate, I imagine. No, I agreed. But perhaps the most important research I'll ever do. We stepped out into the swirling snow, the campus deserted and silent around us. As we walked toward the parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, not by anything physical, but by attention from somewhere beyond the falling snow, beyond the night sky, beyond the thin barrier that separated our reality from theirs. They were patient. They had eternity to wait. And the world was full of keys and coins and artifacts, each one a potential doorway for those who knew how to use them. But now I was watching too, and I was no longer alone. In my pocket, I carried the small journal I had begun keeping after our experience at the Convergence, a record of everything we had learned about the entities and the objects they used to reach our world. Its first page bore a simple warning, written in my careful. The page in my journal froze mid-sentence, as if the thought itself had been interrupted, or perhaps as if a warning against completing it had emerged from some deeper intuition. I stared at those unfinished words as Elaine and I made our way through the thickening snow, the wind picking up around us. Something wrong? Elaine asked, noticing my distraction. Just thinking about the journal, I replied. There's so much we don't understand yet. We reached her car, an aging Volvo that seemed particularly vulnerable in the growing storm. As she unlocked it, a flicker of movement caught my eye across the parking lot, a tall figure standing motionless between two lampposts, almost indistinguishable from the shadows except for how the falling snow seemed to avoid it entirely. Get in the car, I said quietly, not taking my eyes off the figure. Now. Elaine followed my gaze, stiffening when she saw what I was looking at. Is that? I don't know. But I don't want to find out here. I opened the passenger door and slid in as she hurriedly started the engine. As we pulled away, I looked back. The figure remained motionless, but as we turned onto the main road, I could have sworn it tilted its head upward, as if following our departure. You've seen them before, Elaine said, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Like that one. Not exactly like that, I admitted. The ones I encountered were more substantial. That looked almost like an echo or an afterimage. Or a scout, she suggested grimly. The medallion in her bag seemed to grow heavier between us, its presence a silent confirmation of her theory. Eleanor's apartment was located in an old Victorian house that had been converted into 4 separate units. Despite the lateness of the hour and the worsening weather, light still burned in her windows as we approached. She answered the door on the first knock, as if she'd been waiting for us. I thought you might come tonight, she said, ushering us inside. Her living room was much as I remembered it, books everywhere, strange artifacts on every surface, the air heavy with incense. The only addition was a large corkboard on one wall, covered with maps, photographs, and newspaper clippings, all connected by red string. Irene sat cross-legged on the floor near the fireplace, transcribing something from an ancient-looking tome into a modern notebook. She looked up as we entered, her expression darkening when she saw our faces. "What's happened?" she asked, setting aside her work. Without preamble, Elaine removed the cloth-wrapped medallion from her bag and placed it on the coffee table. Eleanor inhaled sharply, while Irene instinctively moved back several inches. "Where did you find this?" Eleanor asked, leaning close to the bundle without touching it. As Elaine explained about Professor Hargrove's collection and his research into threshold artifacts, I studied Eleanor's corkboard. It was a meticulous cataloging of unusual events stretching back decades, unexplained disappearances, accounts of strange phenomena, locations where the fabric of reality seemed thinner than others. I recognized the forest clearing where we had performed the ritual, marked with a red pen. "So they're trying again," Irene said when Elaine had finished. "Using a different approach." "I don't think they ever stopped," Eleanor replied. She cautiously unwrapped the cloth with a pencil, revealing the medallion without touching it. The Watcher's Eye. "I've read about this. It's older than the key, possibly Mesopotamian in origin. The legends say it allows the wearer to perceive the entities, to see their true forms without going mad." "That's useful," I said, turning away from the corkboard. "And dangerous," she countered. "Because while you can see them, they can also see you more clearly, more completely than ever before. It creates a channel, just like the key did, but focused on perception rather than physical manifestation." Hargrove's medical examiner noted shattered mirrors, Elaine said quietly, "and an expression of extreme terror." Eleanor nodded grimly. "He saw something in their reflections. Something his mind couldn't process. We need to take it to the Convergence," I suggested. "Neutralize it like we did with the key." "Not yet," Eleanor said, surprising me. "This is different. The key was meant to open a door. This," she gestured at the medallion, "this is meant to reveal what's already here, walking among us unseen." A cold silence fell over the room at her words. "You think they've already broken through?" Irene said finally. "In some form." "I think they never left completely," Eleanor corrected. "The ritual closed the main doorway, but there are always cracks in reality, small fissures where they can slip through in limited form. Usually, they can't maintain a presence here for long, but if they've found human allies—" "Hargrove," I suggested. "Or whoever gave him the medallion," Elaine added. Eleanor nodded toward her corkboard. "I've been tracking unusual incidents since the ritual. Disappearances, sudden personality changes, people claiming to have seen impossible things. There's a pattern forming." She turned back to us, her expression resolute. "We need to use the medallion." "What?" I stared at her in disbelief. "After what it did to Hargrove." "We'll be careful," she insisted. "Controlled environment, protective measures. But we need to understand what we're fighting. If they've found another way in, containing the medallion won't be enough." Irene had already begun clearing space in the center of the room, pushing furniture against the walls and retrieving candles from a cabinet. "This is insane," I protested, even as I found myself helping her. "We barely survived the last encounter. The alternative is waiting for them to gather enough strength to try again," Eleanor said, opening a trunk filled with strange objects, herbs, crystals, small bottles of liquid. "And next time, they might succeed." Elaine, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly spoke up. "I'll do it." We all turned to look at her. "I'll wear the medallion," she clarified. "I'm the one who brought it to you. And I'm the one with the least experience. You three need to be ready to act if something goes wrong." "Absolutely not," I said immediately. You have no idea what you're volunteering for. Neither do you, she countered. Not really. You've seen manifestations, echoes. But you haven't seen them directly, in their true form. The medallion might allow that without the danger of full physical manifestation. She has a point, Irene said reluctantly. And we need someone with fresh perception, someone whose mind hasn't already been influenced by previous contact. I looked to Eleanor, hoping she would back me up, but she was already nodding slowly. It makes a certain sense. But we'll take every precaution. Salt circles, binding agents, a tether to pull you back if needed. This is happening too fast, I objected. We should research more, prepare better. Time is on our side, Eleanor said grimly. Whatever's happening, it's accelerating. I can feel it, like pressure building before a storm. Outside, as if to emphasize her point, the wind howled against the windows, snow swirling in the darkness. The medallion on the table seemed to gleam in the firelight, its ancient symbols shifting subtly when viewed from different angles. One glimpse, Eleanor promised, meeting Elaine's eyes. Just enough to understand what we're facing. Then we remove it immediately. Elaine nodded, her face pale but determined. One glimpse. As they began preparations, drawing concentric circles of salt and herbs on the floor, positioning candles at precise intervals, I found myself standing apart, a deep unease growing within me. The medallion had found its way to us too easily, too conveniently. What if this was exactly what they wanted? What if the entities had planned this, had manipulated events to bring the medallion to people who would actually use it instead of locking it away? Wait, I said suddenly, as Elaine seated herself in the center of the circles and Eleanor prepared to hand her the medallion. This doesn't feel right. Fear is natural, Eleanor said gently. But it's not fear, I interrupted. It's logic. Why would they create an artifact that allows humans to see them clearly if that visibility is a disadvantage? What if the seeing goes both ways? What if using this is exactly what they're counting on? Irene paused in her preparation, clearly troubled by my reasoning. He might be right. It's too convenient. Eleanor hesitated, the medallion held carefully in a cloth between her fingers. What do you suggest? That we ignore it? Bury it and hope no one else finds it? No. I stepped forward, an idea forming. We use it, but not directly. Not on person. I turned to Elaine. You said all the mirrors in Hargrove's office were shattered. What if he saw them through the reflections? Mirrors as conduits, Eleanor murmured, her eyes widening with understanding. It's an old concept in many magical traditions, mirrors as windows or doors to other realms. So instead of wearing it, we place it before a mirror, I suggested. Let it show us what it wants to show, but through a barrier, a filter. It might work, Irene said slowly. The reflection would create a degree of separation, enough to observe without direct contact. Eleanor considered for a moment, then nodded. We'll need to adjust the protective circles, but yes. It's safer. Relief washed over me as they modified their preparations, placing a small hand mirror at the center of the innermost circle instead of preparing for Elaine to wear the medallion. Eleanor carefully positioned the watcher's eye before it, making sure it was reflected in the glass. Everyone stay behind the outer circle, she instructed, lighting the final candle. No matter what you see, do not cross the lines. We gathered at the edge of the protective circles, watching intently as Eleanor began to recite strange words in a language I didn't recognize. The candle flames stretched tall, then bent inward toward the mirror as if drawn by an unseen force. The medallion began to emit a faint, pulsing glow that was reflected and amplified by the mirror's surface. For several long moments, nothing else happened. The mirror showed only what it should, the reflection of the medallion and the ceiling above it. Then the glass began to darken, as if a shadow were passing across it from within. "It's working," Eleanor whispered, her voice tight with tension. The shadow in the mirror coalesced, forming what appeared to be a landscape, a barren plain under a twilight sky filled with impossible constellations. Tall, angular structures rose in the distance, their architecture defying conventional geometry. And moving across this alien terrain were shapes, some vaguely humanoid, others completely unrecognizable, their forms shifting and flowing as if physical matter was merely a suggestion rather than a requirement. "My God," Elaine breathed beside me. "There are so many of them." As we watched, transfixed, one of the figures in the mirror seemed to stop its movement across the plain. Slowly, deliberately, it turned, not toward the others of its kind, but toward us. Toward the mirror itself. It knew we were watching. The temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began to form on the mirror's surface, creeping outward from the center. The figure in the reflection grew larger, as if approaching the window we had opened between worlds. "Break the connection," I urged Eleanor. "Now!" She began another incantation, her voice raised urgently, but the frost continued to spread, reaching the edge of the mirror and spilling onto the floor, crawling across the protective circles. The figure in the mirror was no longer distant. It pressed against the glass from the other side, its form a constantly shifting amalgamation of angles and curves that hurt to look at directly. Where a face might be, if such creatures had faces, was a swirling vortex of darkness. "The circles aren't holding," Irene warned, backing away. "The cold is breaking the barriers." With a sharp crack, the mirror split down the middle, the fractures spreading outward in a spiderweb pattern. Yet still the image remained, not of the distant plane now, but only of the entity, its impossible form filling the entire reflective surface. "Cover it," I shouted, looking frantically for something to throw over the mirror. Elaine reacted first, grabbing a heavy book from Eleanor's shelf and slamming it down over the fractured glass. For an instant, nothing happened. Then a shudder ran through the room, as if reality itself had convulsed, and the candle flames snuffed out simultaneously. Darkness engulfed us, broken only by the faint glow still emanating from beneath the book. The temperature continued to drop, our breath visible in the air. "This isn't working," Eleanor's voice came from the darkness. "It's too strong. The medallion is amplifying its presence." "We need to separate them," Irene suggested. "Break the connection between the medallion and the mirror." I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, activating the flashlight function. In its harsh beam, I could see the book vibrating slightly on top of the shattered mirror, frost creeping up its leather binding. The medallion lay just beside it, pulsing with an unnatural light. Moving carefully, I approached the inner circle, using a nearby fireplace poker to nudge the medallion away from the mirror. As soon as the contact was broken, the book stopped vibrating and the frost's advance halted. "Quick," Eleanor said, retrieving a small wooden box lined with strange symbols. "Put the medallion in here." I used the poker to lift the coin and drop it into the box, which Eleanor immediately sealed with wax and a muttered incantation. The unnatural glow faded, and slowly, the temperature in the room began to rise again. None of us spoke for several long moments, the only sound our ragged breathing and the howling wind outside. Finally, Elaine broke the silence. "It saw us," she said quietly. "It recognized what we were doing. And it was waiting," I added, the realization chilling me more than the supernatural cold had. It wasn't surprised to see us looking through. It expected it. Eleanor carefully removed the book from atop the shattered mirror, revealing the fractured glass beneath. The reflection now showed only the normal ceiling above, but the cracks formed a distinct pattern, a symbol similar to those on the medallion, but larger, more complex. A message, Irene suggested, studying the pattern. Or a mark. A claim, Eleanor corrected grimly. It's marking this space. This reality. For what purpose? Elaine asked. Eleanor met each of our eyes in turn. Colonization. They're not just looking for a way in anymore. They're preparing for an invasion. Who's trying to make me remember? The question had been haunting me since the first letter arrived 3 days ago. No return address, no signature, just cream-colored stationery with a message typed in courier font that seemed both accusatory and intimate. You thought 20 years would be enough to forget. It wasn't. My name is Thomas Reeves, and until last week, I'd convinced myself I was ordinary. A freelance graphic designer working from a converted industrial loft in Portland, I'd spent the last decade building a quiet life that felt safe. My apartment overlooked the river, offering panoramic views that I captured in countless sketches. My neighbors knew me as the reserved guy who occasionally brought homemade bread to building meetings. What they didn't know was that Thomas Reeves wasn't the name I was born with. I set my coffee mug down on the kitchen counter, the ceramic making a hollow sound against the concrete surface. Outside, rain tapped against my windows in an irregular rhythm that normally would have been soothing. Now it felt like Morse code I couldn't decipher. The third letter had arrived this morning. Like the others, it had been slipped under my door sometime before dawn. I checked the building's security footage, but there was a convenient 40-minute gap around 3 a.m., a technical glitch, according to the building manager. This letter contained a faded photograph. 2 teenage boys standing in front of a cabin. One was unmistakably me, skinnier, with longer hair, but my eyes hadn't changed. The other boy's face had been meticulously scratched out with what must have been a razor blade. The back of the photo had 3 words written in faded blue ink, "Remember Lake Everett?" My hands trembled as I placed the photo face down on the counter. I hadn't heard that name in 20 years. Hadn't let myself think about it. About what happened there. I moved to the window, scanning the street below through gaps in the partially closed blinds. Was someone watching? The feeling of eyes on me had been constant since the first letter. I noticed a black sedan parked across the street that hadn't been there yesterday. Or had it? I was beginning to doubt my own observations. My phone buzzed, making me flinch. Unknown number. Hello? I answered, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. Nothing but breathing on the other end. Slow, deliberate breaths. Who is this? I demanded, my heart hammering against my ribs. The breathing continued for 5 more seconds before the line went dead. I dropped the phone like it had burned me. Moving quickly to the door, I checked the deadbolt and security chain, then wedged a chair under the doorknob, a futile gesture, I knew, but it gave me a momentary sense of control. Back in the kitchen, I opened my laptop and hesitated over the search bar. After 20 years of carefully avoiding any connection to my past, I was about to willingly open that door. My fingers hovered over the keys before I finally typed Lake Everett Disappearance 2005. The search results loaded instantly. News headlines I'd spent decades trying to forget. Search continues for missing teen at Lake Everett. Police question witnesses in Lake Everett case. Memorial service held for Lake Everett victim. I closed the laptop abruptly, unable to face the articles. The memories were already flooding back, fractured images I'd suppressed for so long they felt like scenes from someone else's nightmare. The cabin, the argument, the blood on my hands, the weight as we carried him to the lake, the sound of the water accepting its burden. A sharp knock at my door jolted me from the flashback. I froze, eyes fixed on the door, waiting. Another knock, more insistent this time. Mr. Reeves? A woman's voice, unfamiliar. Portland Police Department. We'd like to speak with you. My throat constricted. They could know. There was no way they could know after all this time. The case had gone cold years ago. We'd been so careful. But the letters, whoever sent them knew everything. Mr. Reeves? We know you're home. Please open the door. I moved toward the door mechanically, each step an effort against the growing weight of dread. Through the peephole, I saw a woman in plain clothes holding up a badge. With shaking hands, I removed the chair, unlatched the chain, and opened the door just enough to see her face. Detective Elena Mercer, she said, her expression revealing nothing. May I come in? We have some questions about a cold case that's recently become active again. Behind her stood a taller officer, his hand resting casually near his holster. He was looking at me with the measured gaze of someone assessing a threat. What's this about? I managed to ask, though I already knew. Detective Mercer's eyes narrowed slightly. It's about what happened at Lake Everett in 2005, Mr. Reeves. Or should I call you by your birth name? The hallway seemed to tilt beneath my feet. The walls of the carefully constructed life I built were crumbling around me, and there was nowhere left to hide. I let the detectives into my apartment with the resignation of someone who had been expecting this moment for 20 years. Detective Mercer moved with purposeful efficiency, her eyes scanning my living space, cataloging details. The male officer, who introduced himself as Detective Grant, positioned himself near the door, blocking my exit. I realized with a chill. Nice place, Mercer commented, running her finger along the edge of my drafting table. Successful graphic designer, respected in your field. You've built quite a life for yourself, Nicholas. The name hit me like a physical blow. Nicholas Adler. A name I hadn't heard spoken aloud in 2 decades. I go by Thomas now, I said quietly. Legally changed in 2006, she nodded. Right after the investigation at Lake Everett went cold. She paused by my kitchen counter where the letters lay. Mind if I look at these? Before I could answer, she was already examining them through a pair of latex gloves she pulled from her pocket. She studied the photograph with particular interest. Daniel Whitaker, she said, tapping the scratched-out face in the photo. Your best friend since kindergarten. Until he disappeared at Lake Everett during a camping trip with you and 3 other friends. My mouth had gone dry. I've already told the police everything I know. 20 years ago. Mercer smiled thinly. Did you? Because we've received some new information that suggests otherwise. She pulled out her phone and showed me a text message. Ask Nicholas Adler about the boat shed. Ask him what they used to weigh down the body. The room tilted again. No one knew about the boat shed. No one except the 4 of us who were there that night. Who sent you that? I whispered. We were hoping you might help us figure that out, Detective Grant said from his position by the door. It came from a burner phone. Same person who's been sending you these letters, we suspect. I sank into a chair, my legs suddenly unable to support me. I don't understand. Why now? After all this time? Mercer leaned against my kitchen counter, studying me. That's what's interesting. 20 years is a significant anniversary, isn't it? But there's more. She pulled out a small evidence bag containing a newspaper clipping. 2 weeks ago, construction crews broke ground on a new marina project at Lake Everett. They're draining parts of the north side to expand the docks. The north side, where the boat shed stood. The lake is being partially drained, I repeated numbly. Starting next week, Mercer confirmed. Which makes the timing of these messages rather interesting, doesn't it? My mind raced. Someone knew. One of us had broken a pact of silence. Marcus? Elliot? Rebecca? We'd sworn never to speak of that night again and gone our separate ways, built new lives. But one of them must have cracked. I want a lawyer, I said finally. Mercer nodded as if she'd expected this. That's your right. But we're not arresting you, yet. We're just having a conversation. She slid a business card across the table. When you're ready to talk about what really happened to Daniel Whitaker, call me. They left as abruptly as they'd arrived, leaving me alone with the shattered remains of my carefully constructed life. I moved to the window and watched them exit the building. They didn't drive away immediately, instead sitting in their unmarked car, watching my building. Waiting. My phone rang again, unknown number. With trembling fingers, I answered. Hello, Nicholas. A digitally altered voice, impossible to identify as male or female. Did you enjoy your visit from the police? Who is this? I demanded. Someone who knows what you did. The voice was eerily calm. Someone who was there. Marcus? I whispered. Elliot? Rebecca? A mechanical laugh. You'll find out soon enough. Check your email. The line went dead. I rushed to my laptop and found a new message waiting in my inbox. The subject line, The Truth About Lake Everett. I clicked it open with shaking hands. There was no text in the body, just an attachment, a video file. I downloaded it and pressed play, dread pooling in my stomach. The footage was grainy, shot in night vision surveillance quality. It showed the interior of a small shed illuminated by a single hanging bulb. I recognized it instantly, the boat shed at Lake Everett. The timestamp in the corner read July 15, 2005. The night Daniel disappeared. For terrified teenagers stood around a fifth figure lying motionless on the floor. Me, Marcus, Elliot, and Rebecca staring down at Daniel's body. Blood pooled beneath his head where he'd struck it on the corner of a workbench during the fight. We were arguing, panicking. I couldn't hear the audio, but I remembered the words clearly enough. It was an accident. Marcus had shouted. They won't believe us, Rebecca had sobbed. Look at him. He's dead because of us. We have to get rid of the body, Elliot had said, always the pragmatic one. No one can ever know what happened here, my younger self had agreed. The video showed us wrapping Daniel's body in a tarp, weighing it down with chains and concrete blocks from the shed. Then the four of us carrying our grim bundle down to the dock, loading it onto the small motorboat, and heading out into the darkness of the lake. The video ended abruptly as the boat disappeared from view. I slammed the laptop closed, bile rising in my throat. It was impossible. There had been no cameras in the boat shed. No one had recorded what happened that night. Unless one of us had set up the camera beforehand. Had one of my friends been planning something that night? Had Daniel's death not been the accident we all believed it to be? Another email notification appeared on my phone. From the same unknown sender. This one contained only text. The tape will go to the police in 48 hours unless you find the truth. All of you lied that night. Time to face what really happened at Lake Everett. P.S. I've sent similar messages to Marcus, Elliot, and Rebecca. The reunion is about to begin. I stared at the phone in horror. Whoever was doing this had contacted all of us. After 20 years of silence, the 4 surviving members of that night would be forced together again. I moved quickly to my bedroom and pulled a duffel bag from under the bed. Running wasn't an option. The police were watching my building, and the video meant they'd eventually have enough evidence for an arrest. But I couldn't stay here either, not with someone tracking my every move. As I threw clothes into the bag, my phone buzzed with a text message from another unknown number. "Nick, it's Rebecca. We need to talk. Meet me at the Riverside Hotel, room 412. Come alone. They contacted you too, didn't they?" Rebecca. I hadn't spoken to her since we'd all separated after that summer, each of us fleeing to different corners of the country, trying to outrun the memory of what we'd done. Now she was here, in Portland. I finished packing and slipped the letters and photo into my bag. Whatever game this anonymous tormentor was playing, the answers lay in the past, with the people who shared my darkest secret. As I locked my apartment, I felt certain of one thing: not all of us would survive the reunion. The Riverside Hotel stood like a weathered sentinel along Portland's waterfront, its faded Art Deco facade at odds with the gleaming glass towers surrounding it. I circled the block twice before entering, checking for police surveillance or any sign I'd been followed. The detective's car was no longer outside my building when I'd left through the service entrance, but paranoia had become my constant companion. The lobby was sparsely populated at this hour, an elderly couple examining a city map, a tired-looking receptionist scrolling on her phone. I took the stairs instead of the elevator, unwilling to be trapped in such a confined space. By the time I reached the 4th floor, my heart was pounding from more than just physical exertion. Room 412 was at the end of a long corridor. I stood outside the door for nearly a minute, listening for voices or movement within. Hearing nothing, I knocked softly. "Rebecca?" "It's me." The door opened immediately, revealing a woman I barely recognized. Rebecca Chen had been a vivacious, athletic teenager with long black hair and a perpetual smile. The woman before me was rail thin, with premature lines around her eyes and short-cropped hair streaked with gray despite being only 38. The only unchanged feature was her intense dark eyes, now widened with a fear that mirrored my own. "Nick," she whispered, pulling me inside and quickly securing the 3 separate locks on the door. "Thank God you came." The room was a standard mid-range hotel accommodation, but Rebecca had transformed it into something resembling a war room. Printouts of emails and photographs covered one wall, connected by strings of different colors. Her laptop displayed a map with 4 red dots in different locations across the country. A police scanner hummed quietly in the corner. "You got the video too?" I asked, dropping my bag on the floor. She nodded grimly. "Yesterday morning." Then the text about the lake being drained. She gestured to the wall of documents. "I've been trying to piece it together. figure out who's doing this to us. Have you heard from the others? Elliot's on his way. He's driving in from Seattle. She handed me a bottle of water from the mini fridge. Marcus is off the grid. His number's disconnected, and his apartment in Chicago was cleaned out 2 weeks ago according to his landlord. I sank into the desk chair. The police came to see me today. Rebecca's face paled further. What did they know? Not everything, but they know about the boat shed. Someone texted them. I paused. They know the lake is being drained, and they suspect it's connected to Daniel's disappearance. We're out of time, she murmured, more to herself than to me. She turned to face the wall of documents again. I think I know who's behind this. One of us? I asked. Marcus? She shook her head. Daniel's sister. Catherine. The name hit me with unexpected force. Catherine Whitaker had been 14 when her brother disappeared. I remembered her at the memorial service, her tear-stained face full of confusion and anger as we, her brother's best friends, stood awkwardly, our grief performative, our guilt hidden behind rehearsed expressions of shock and dismay. Catherine? I repeated. But how would she know? We never told anyone. Someone might have. Rebecca pointed to a newspaper clipping on her wall. She became a forensic analyst for the FBI, specialized in cold cases. 2 months ago, she took a leave of absence. The pieces began to align in my mind. You think she's been investigating us all these years? That she somehow found evidence? I think she never stopped looking for the truth, Rebecca said softly. And I think she found something that led her to believe one of us would crack under pressure. A sharp knock at the door made us both freeze. Rebecca? It's Elliot. Rebecca moved to the door but checked the peephole before unlocking it. The man who entered was barely recognizable as the confident, athletic Elliot Barnes I'd known. His once muscular frame had softened, his blonde hair had receded, and wire-rimmed glasses sat on a nose that had been broken at least once since I'd last seen him. Holy shit, he breathed when he saw me. Nicholas Adler in the flesh. It's Thomas now, I said automatically. Right. Of course. His eyes darted nervously around the room before settling on Rebecca's wall of evidence. You've been busy. Someone has to figure out what's happening, she replied tersely. Elliot dropped his bag and moved to examine the documents. So we're being blackmailed by Daniel's sister. What does she want? Money? The truth, Rebecca said. She wants to know exactly what happened that night. An uncomfortable silence fell between us. For 20 years, we'd maintained the story we concocted in the panicked hours after Daniel's death. An accident during a late-night swim. A current that carried him away. Our desperate search until morning when we finally called the authorities. They dragged the lake for days but found nothing because we'd made sure his body would never be found. Or so we thought. Yet they drained the north side of the lake. Elliot began. They'll find him, I finished. Or what's left of him. Rebecca rubbed her temples. We need to talk about what really happened. All of it. We know what happened, Elliot snapped. We were there. Do we? Rebecca challenged, her voice suddenly hard. Because I've spent 20 years replaying that night in my head, and there are gaps. Things that don't make sense. I thought about the video, the surveillance footage that shouldn't have existed. Like how that camera got into the boat shed. I suggested. Elliot frowned. What camera? The one that recorded us moving Daniel's body, Rebecca explained. The footage Catherine sent us. His face went slack with genuine shock. There's video? I didn't get any video. Just letters and a text about the lake. Rebecca and I exchanged looks. That's odd, I said carefully. We both received the same video file. Show me, Elliot demanded. Rebecca opened her laptop and pulled up the video. Elliot watched in horror as the footage played, showing us in the boat shed, arguing over Daniel's body. This isn't possible, he whispered. There was no camera. Unless one of us put it there, I said, studying his reaction. Or Catherine somehow found footage we didn't know existed. Elliot's eyes narrowed. You think I had something to do with this? That I've been sitting on this footage for 20 years? Someone has, Rebecca pointed out. And now the four of us are being drawn together again right as the lake is about to give up its secrets. 4, I repeated. Where's Marcus in all this? Rebecca turned back to her wall. That's what worries me. His social media went dark 3 weeks ago. His phone's disconnected. It's like he's vanished. Or he's Catherine's source, Elliot suggested. Maybe he cracked, told her everything, and now they're working together. A notification sound from Rebecca's laptop interrupted us. She clicked on a new email that had just arrived from an anonymous address. It contained a single image, a photo taken earlier that day of the three of us entering the hotel separately. We were being watched. Below the photo was a short message. The game ends tomorrow. Meet at Lake Everett Boat Shed at midnight if you want the truth about what really happened to Daniel. All players must be present or the police get everything. It's a trap, Elliot muttered. She's going to have the police waiting for us. Maybe, Rebecca acknowledged. But what choice do we have? If she has the video, she has enough to send us all to prison. There's something else, I said slowly, pieces falling into place. The photograph I received, the one with Daniel's face scratched out. There were only 5 copies of that photo. One for each of us who was at the lake that weekend. So? Elliot asked. So mine is still in a storage locker in Boston. If Catherine sent it, she got it from one of you. Rebecca shook her head. Mine was destroyed in a house fire 5 years ago. We both looked at Elliot, who raised his hands defensively. I haven't seen mine in years. It could have been stolen. Or given to Catherine, Rebecca suggested. By Marcus. The police scanner in the corner suddenly crackled to life with increased chatter. Rebecca moved quickly to turn up the volume. Report of a body discovered in the Willamette River near the Steel Bridge. Male, approximately 40 years of age, no identification. A heavy silence fell over the room as the description continued. The physical details matched Marcus perfectly. It could be a coincidence, I said, not believing it myself. Rebecca was already gathering her documents from the wall. We need to go. Now. If that's Marcus, and Catherine found him before contacting us, then she already knows everything he knew, Elliot finished grimly. And we're next, I added, the weight of 20 years of guilt threatening to crush me. Lake Everett, midnight tomorrow. I guess we're having a reunion after all. As we hastily packed our belongings, I caught Rebecca watching me with an unreadable expression. What? I asked. I was just thinking, she said quietly. We've all been assuming Catherine wants justice for her brother. But what if it's something else? What if she knows something about that night that we don't? The question hung in the air between us, unanswered but unsettling. Because deep down, beneath the carefully constructed narrative we maintained for 20 years, each of us harbored the same terrible suspicion that Daniel's death hadn't been the accident we convinced ourselves it was. The drive to Lake Everett took just under 3 hours. We traveled in Rebecca's car, a nondescript gray sedan she'd rented under a false name. The familiar landscape of the Oregon countryside unfolded before us, summer foliage now transformed by autumn into a tapestry of crimson and gold. In different circumstances, it might have been beautiful. None of us spoke much during the journey. Elliot sat in the back seat, constantly checking his phone and the road behind us for signs of pursuit. Rebecca drove with mechanical precision, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. I watched the approaching mountains with growing dread, memories flooding back with each mile. Lake Everett had once been a popular vacation spot for Portland families, with its pristine waters and surrounding hiking trails. The boat shed had been part of a small marina on the North Shore, used by the rental company that operated there during summer months. After Daniel's disappearance, the lake's reputation had suffered. Tourism declined, businesses closed. According to Rebecca's research, the new development project was an attempt to revitalize the area, luxury condos, and an expanded marina that required reshaping parts of the shoreline. Did the police confirm it was Marcus? I finally asked, breaking the tense silence. Rebecca kept her eyes on the road. No official identification yet. But I have a contact in the Portland PD. The body matches Marcus's description, right down to the scar on his left shoulder from that mountain biking accident sophomore year. How did he die? Elliot asked from the back seat. Initial reports suggest drowning, but there were inconsistencies. She paused. Signs of a struggle. Bruising around the wrists and neck. Murder, I said flatly. Rebecca nodded. Most likely. Catherine? Elliot suggested. Or someone she hired, Rebecca replied. Either way, it confirms my theory. This isn't just about exposing our secret. This is personal. I turned to look at her. You think she's planning to kill us all? I think she wants us to suffer first. To feel the fear and helplessness her brother must have felt. Rebecca's voice hardened. I think Lake Everett is the perfect place for a revenge. We lapsed back into silence as the car climbed higher into the mountains. The road narrowed, winding through dense forest until we crested a final hill and Lake Everett came into view below us. Even from this distance, I could see changes, construction equipment gathered on the North Shore, temporary buildings housing the development project's offices. Rebecca pulled into a viewpoint turnout above the lake. We should wait until dark. Less chance of being seen by construction workers or security. Elliot leaned forward between the front seats. We need to talk about what we're going to do when we meet Catherine. If she's already killed Marcus. We need to know exactly what she knows first, I interjected. And why she's doing this now, after all these years. Besides the lake being drained? Rebecca asked sardonically. I'd say that's motive enough. But the video, I insisted. It doesn't make sense. None of us set up a camera, right? Elliot and Rebecca exchanged glances. Right? I repeated. Of course not, Elliot said, too quickly. Rebecca remained silent, her eyes fixed on the lake below. Rebecca? I prompted. She sighed deeply. There's something I never told any of you about that weekend. My stomach tightened with apprehension. What? Daniel contacted me the day before we left for the lake. He was nervous about something. Said he needed to talk to me privately once we got there. She swallowed hard. He mentioned Marcus specifically. Said he discovered something about him that changed everything. And you never thought to share this information? Elliot's voice rose with incredulity. After he died, it didn't seem relevant, she shot back. We were all focused on covering up what happened. What did he find out about Marcus? I asked. Rebecca shook her head. He never got the chance to tell me. But I've been wondering if that's what Catherine found, whatever Daniel was going to reveal. The implication hung heavily between us. Had Marcus's death been random? Or was it connected to some secret from 20 years ago? So what's the plan? Elliot asked after several tense moments. We show up at midnight and just hope Catherine doesn't have a gun pointed at us? We need leverage, I said, an idea forming. The videotape proves we moved Daniel's body, but it doesn't show how he died. We still maintain it was an accident, his head hitting the workbench during a scuffle. What's your point? Rebecca asked. My point is, if Catherine had definitive proof that one of us deliberately killed her brother, she would have gone straight to the police. I leaned back in my seat. She's fishing. She knows something happened, but not exactly what. Rebecca considered this. So we stick to our story? That it was an accident? That's been the plan for 20 years, Elliot said tersely. Why change it now? I turned to look at him directly. Because one of us is lying. One of us knows exactly what happened to Daniel, and it wasn't an accident. The atmosphere in the car shifted palpably. 2 decades of unspoken suspicions suddenly lay bare. That's a serious accusation, Elliot said quietly. Is it? I challenged. Daniel contacts Rebecca about some discovery concerning Marcus. Then Daniel ends up dead. Now Marcus is dead too. Seems like more than coincidence. You think Marcus killed Daniel deliberately? Rebecca asked. I think someone did, I replied. And Catherine may have figured it out. The sun was beginning to set, painting the lake with streaks of orange and crimson. We watched in silence as shadows lengthened across the water. What if we just ran? Elliot suggested suddenly. Disappeared. New identities, new countries. We tried that once, Rebecca reminded him. Look where we are now. I checked my watch. 8 hours until midnight. We should find somewhere to wait, prepare ourselves. For what? Elliot asked. A confrontation? A confession? Our arrests? For the truth, I said simply. After 20 years, don't you want to know what really happened? Neither of them answered, but their silence was confirmation enough. Whatever Catherine had planned for us at the boat shed, we were going to face it together, just as we should have faced the consequences of that night 20 years ago. As darkness fell, we drove down to the lake. The construction site was deserted, workers gone for the day. Yellow caution tape and temporary fencing surrounded the north shore, but it was easy enough to find a gap. We left the car hidden among trees half a mile away and approached on foot, using flashlights sparingly. The landscape was both familiar and alien, the shoreline altered by preliminary excavation, the water level noticeably lower than I remembered. Heavy machinery stood like sleeping beasts in the moonlight, poised to continue their work of reshaping the lake's edge. And there, standing in shadow where it had always been, was the boat shed. It looked smaller than in my memories, its wooden walls withered nearly to gray, roof sagging in the middle. Construction plans had marked it for demolition, but for now, it remained a silent witness to what we had done. "I can't believe it's still here," Rebecca whispered, her breath visible in the cold night air. Elliot hung back, reluctance evident in every line of his body. "I don't like this. We're exposed out here." I moved toward the shed, drawn by a compulsion stronger than fear. The door hung partially open, its padlock long since rusted away. Inside was darkness, complete and absolute. "We should wait," Rebecca cautioned, catching my arm. "It's only 10. Catherine said midnight. "I need to see it," I insisted, pulling free. "I need to remember exactly what happened." I switched on my flashlight and stepped inside. The beam illuminated a space smaller than I remembered, empty now save for cobwebs and debris. The workbench where Daniel had fallen still stood against the far wall, its surface thick with dust. I moved toward it slowly, playing my light across its surface. "This is where he hit his head," I said softly. "Right here." Rebecca and Elliot had followed me inside, their own flashlights creating intersecting beams of light. "It happened so fast," Rebecca murmured. "One minute they were arguing, the next." "What were they arguing about?" I asked suddenly. "I never knew." I came in at the end, saw Daniel on the floor. Elliot and Rebecca exchanged glances again. "You were getting drinks from the cabin," Elliot said. Daniel confronted Marcus about something. It got heated. "About what?" I pressed. Rebecca sighed. "Daniel accused Marcus of stealing money from his parents. A lot of money. He said he had proof." "And you never told me this?" I was stunned. All these years, I thought it was just a stupid fight that got out of hand. "It was easier that way," Elliot said defensively. "The fewer details you knew, the less you had to lie about." I was about to respond when a noise outside froze us all in place. Footsteps on the wooden dock, approaching the shed. Elliot killed his flashlight immediately. Rebecca and I followed suit. The darkness was complete, save for thin streaks of moonlight through gaps in the roof. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. We could hear breathing, slow, measured breaths. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the confined space. "Catherine?" No response. Just the continued sound of breathing. "We know it's you," Rebecca tried. "We're here to talk." "About Daniel." The door creaked wider. A figure stood silhouetted against the night sky, face hidden in shadow. 20 years, a woman's voice said softly. 20 years I've waited for this moment." She stepped into the shed, and moonlight illuminated the face of Catherine Whitaker. She was 34 now, her resemblance to Daniel unmistakable, the same deep-set eyes, the same determined set to her jaw. She wore dark clothing and gloves. In her right hand, she held what appeared to be a gun. "All of you," she said, her voice controlled but tight with emotion. "Together again. Where it all began." "Catherine," Rebecca started. "We." "Don't," Catherine cut her off sharply. "Don't you dare say you're sorry. Not yet. Not until you've told me the truth. All of it." She raised her left hand, displaying a small recording device. Tonight, you're going to confess every detail of what happened to my brother. No more lies. I stepped forward slightly. It was an accident, Catherine. A terrible accident. Her laugh was hollow, devoid of humor. An accident? Is that what you've been telling yourselves all these years? She shook her head slowly. I found Marcus, you know, before he ended up in the river. He told me everything. Elliot tensed beside me. If you killed him. I didn't kill him, Catherine interrupted. Though I can't say I mourned when I heard he was dead. Her eyes narrowed. But I think one of you might know more about that than I do. She moved further into the shed, the gun steady in her hand. Let me tell you what I know. Daniel discovered Marcus was stealing from our parents not just petty cash, but tens of thousands from their retirement accounts. He confronted Marcus here, at the lake. There was an argument. The rest? She gestured with the gun. That's where the stories diverge. What did Marcus tell you? Rebecca asked cautiously. Catherine's gaze fixed on her. He said it was Elliot who pushed Daniel during the fight. That Daniel hit his head and died instantly. Elliot's sharp intake of breath echoed in the small space. That's a lie, he hissed. Is it? Catherine challenged. Because the video I found shows something very different from what you've all claimed happened. A chill ran through me. What video? The one you sent us? Catherine smiled thinly. That was just a taste. A sample to get your attention. She reached into her pocket and produced a small flash drive. This contains the full footage. Marcus had a camera hidden in his bag that night. He was planning to record Daniel's accusations, probably to try to discredit him somehow. Instead, he recorded his own crime. Marcus killed Daniel? Rebecca whispered. Not directly, Catherine replied. But he was the reason my brother died. And the three of you helped cover it up. Her voice cracked slightly. You wrapped him in a tarp, weighed him down with chains, and dumped him in the lake like garbage. The shame of it washed over me anew, as fresh as it had been 20 years ago. We panicked, I admitted. We were just kids. We were scared. So was he, Catherine said, her voice suddenly raw with emotion. So was my 14-year-old self when they told me my brother was never coming home, that his body might never be found. She composed herself with visible effort. Tomorrow, they continue draining the north side of the lake. When they find Daniel's remains, and they will find them, I want the world to know exactly what happened to him. Who was responsible, and who covered it up. It won't bring him back, Rebecca said softly. No, Catherine agreed. But it will give him justice. Something you all denied him for 2 decades. The gun in her hand gleamed in the moonlight. Now, one by one, you're going to tell me exactly what happened that night. And I'm going to record every word. She pointed the gun at me first. Starting with you, Nicholas. Or Thomas, or whatever you call yourself these days. Tell me what you saw when you walked into this shed 20 years ago. I swallowed hard, the weight of 2 decades of lies suddenly unbearable. I came back from the cabin with beers. I heard shouting. When I opened the door, I closed my eyes, the memory playing vividly behind my eyelids. Daniel was on the floor. There was blood. Marcus was standing over him, looking shocked. Rebecca was crying. Elliot was trying to check if Daniel was still breathing. And then, Catherine prompted. Then Marcus said we had to hide the body, that no one would believe it was an accident. I took a shaking breath. We argued, but eventually agreed. We were all there. We were all involved. If Daniel's death wasn't an accident, we'd all be accessories. Catherine nodded slowly, processing this. Rebecca, your turn. Rebecca's voice was barely audible. Daniel told me the day before that he had evidence. Bank statements showing Marcus had been stealing money using his father's information. He was going to confront him at the lake, away from everyone else. I should have stopped him, or been there with him. But you weren't, Catherine stated flatly. No. I was at the cabin with Elliot when we heard the shouting. We ran down to the shed together. Rebecca's voice steadied slightly. When we got here, Marcus and Daniel were struggling. Daniel fell back, hit his head on the corner of the workbench. There was so much blood. Catherine turned to Elliot. And you? What's your version? Elliot remained silent, his face half hidden in shadow. Elliot, I urged. Just tell the truth. After all this time, let's just end it. He looked up then, his expression unreadable. The truth, he repeated. You want the truth? Fine. Marcus didn't push Daniel. I did. Rebecca gasped softly beside me. What? I whispered. Elliot's laugh was bitter. Marcus was stealing from the Whitakers, yes. But I was helping him. We were splitting the money. Daniel found out about both of us. He looked directly at Catherine. When he confronted us, he threatened to go to the police. Marcus panicked, tried to reason with him. I decided it was easier to shut him up permanently. The confession hung in the air like poison. You deliberately killed my brother? Catherine's voice was deadly quiet. I pushed him harder than I meant to, Elliot continued, his tone eerily calm. But yes, I wanted to hurt him. Scare him into keeping quiet. He shrugged. The workbench did the rest. And Marcus knew this, I said slowly. All these years, he knew it wasn't an accident. We both did, Elliot confirmed. But it was easier to let you and Rebecca believe it was just a tragic accident. The guilt was more manageable that way. Catherine's hand tightened on the gun. You took my brother's life over money? Not just money, Elliot said. Your parents were pressing charges against Marcus for something unrelated. If they discovered the theft too, he was looking at serious jail time. We both were. Rebecca's voice shook with rage. You let us live with this guilt for 20 years. Made us accessories to murder. We were all accessories the moment we decided to hide the body, Elliot countered coldly. Don't act so innocent now. Catherine stepped forward, the gun now pointed directly at Elliot's chest. I should kill you right here. But you won't, he replied calmly. Because you're recording this. You want justice through the system, not revenge. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was our breathing and the distant lap of water against the shore. Then Catherine slowly lowered the gun. You're right. I want you to face a jury. I want the world to know what you did. She backed toward the door, keeping the gun loosely trained on us. The police are on their way. I called them before coming here. Told them I had new evidence in my brother's case. She held up a flash drive. This, plus your confessions just now, should be more than enough to put you all away for a very long time. As if on cue, distant sirens became audible, growing louder by the second. Rebecca turned to me, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and resignation. This is it, then. After all these years. I nodded slowly. Maybe it's for the best. Living with this, it's been its own kind of prison. Elliot's face had gone blank, a mask of indifference. But I saw his hand move toward his jacket pocket. Catherine. I shouted in warning. She reacted instantly, raising the gun again, but not before Elliot lunged forward, something metallic flashing in his hand. 3 shots rang out in rapid succession, deafening in the small space. Elliot stumbled backward, crimson blooming across his chest. He looked almost surprised as he collapsed to the dusty floor. Catherine stood frozen, the gun still raised, smoke curling from its barrel. I didn't. She began, her voice suddenly small. He had a knife. I didn't mean to. Rebecca moved cautiously toward Elliot's fallen form and knelt beside him, checking for a pulse. After a moment, she looked up at us and shook her head. The sirens were very close now, red and blue lights visible through the trees surrounding the lake. The past had finally caught up with all of us. As police flashlights swept across the water's edge, searching for the source of the gunshots, I realized that our 20-year deception was about to come to an end. The body in the lake would soon be found. The truth would finally be known. Catherine lowered the gun, letting it hang limply at her side. I just wanted justice for my brother, she whispered. I didn't want more death. I moved to stand beside her, watching the approaching lights. I know, I said quietly. Neither did we. Not then, not now. Together, the 3 of us waited in the doorway of the boat shed, Catherine Whitaker and the last 2 survivors of that fateful night 20 years ago. Waiting for a reckoning long overdue. The interrogation room at the Oregon State Police facility was sterile and impersonal, white walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, 2 uncomfortable chairs, and a camera in the corner recording every word, every gesture. I'd been there for 6 hours, repeating my statement to a succession of detectives, each one hoping I might reveal some new detail, some inconsistency they could exploit. Detective Mercer sat across from me now, her expression unreadable as she reviewed her notes. She'd driven up from Portland immediately after receiving word of the shooting at Lake Everett. In the harsh fluorescent lighting, the lines around her eyes were more pronounced, her exhaustion evident. Let's go through it one more time, she said, her voice neutral. You received anonymous letters that led you to reconnect with Rebecca Chen and Elliot Barnes after 20 years. You learned that Marcus Wilson had been in contact with Catherine Whitaker before his death. You went to Lake Everett to meet Catherine, who claimed to have video evidence of what really happened the night her brother died. I nodded wearily. That's correct. And then Elliot Barnes confessed to deliberately pushing Daniel Whitaker during an argument, causing his death. When Catherine produced a gun, Barnes attacked her with a knife, and she shot him in self-defense. Yes, I confirmed. Everything happened exactly as Rebecca and Catherine have already told you. Mercer leaned back in her chair, studying me carefully. Here's what I don't understand, Mr. Reeves, or should I say, Mr. Adler. Why now? After 20 years of silence, why did Catherine Whitaker suddenly decide to confront all of you? I met her gaze steadily. The lake is being drained for the new development. She knew Daniel's remains would be found. She wanted the truth before that happened. And the video she claimed to have? We haven't found any flash drive at the scene. I don't know, I admitted. In the chaos after the shooting, maybe it was lost. Or maybe there never was one. Maybe she was bluffing to get confessions from us. Mercer nodded slowly. That's possible. What's not in question is that the four of you disposed of Daniel Whitaker's body after his death, regardless of how that death occurred. She closed her notebook. You're looking at serious charges, Mr. Adler. Accessory after the fact, obstruction of justice, concealment of a death. Even with the statute of limitations on some of these, you're facing significant prison time. I absorbed this with resignation. I understand. Your attorney is waiting outside. You'll be formally charged in the morning. She stood, gathering her files. For what it's worth, your cooperation has been noted. After she left, I remained seated, too exhausted to move. In the span of a week, my carefully constructed life had been completely dismantled. Thomas Reeves, respected graphic designer with a quiet Portland life, was gone. In his place was Nicholas Adler, an accessory to a crime 20 years in the past. Yet despite everything, I felt a strange sense of relief. The weight of 2 decades of secrets and lies had been lifted. Whatever punishment awaited me, it couldn't be worse than the self-imposed prison I'd been living in. The door opened again, and a uniformed officer entered. Your attorney's here. Also, you have a visitor who's been cleared to see you. I followed him to a small conference room where my court-appointed lawyer waited, along with an unexpected figure, Rebecca. She looked as exhausted as I felt, her face pale and drawn, but she managed a small smile when I entered. I'll give you two a few minutes, the lawyer said tactfully, stepping outside. Rebecca and I sat across from each other at the table, the events of the past few days hanging between us like a physical presence. Catherine's being charged with manslaughter, she said after a moment. Her attorney is arguing self-defense, which the forensics seemed to support. Elliot had the knife in his hand when he fell. I nodded. What about you? Same charges as you, more or less. My parents are flying in from California. She twisted her wedding ring absently, a detail I hadn't noticed before. My husband is filing for divorce. Can't say I blame him. Finding out your wife helped cover up a death 20 years ago tends to change how you see someone. I'm sorry, I said, meaning it. She shrugged. It was over before this. I just never had the courage to admit it. Her eyes met mine. They found Daniel's remains this morning. The construction crew reported it after the police expanded the search area around the boat shed. The news hit me harder than I'd expected. After 20 years as an abstraction, a memory, a secret, a guilt, Daniel Whitaker was real again. His bones recovered from the silted bottom of Lake Everett, physical evidence of what we had done. His parents are still alive, Rebecca continued. They're coming to claim his remains. Finally able to bury their son after all these years. I thought of the Whitakers, how they must have felt all these years, not knowing exactly what happened to their son, holding on to hope that somehow, someday, they would find answers. And all the while, the four of us had known the truth and said nothing. There's something else, Rebecca said, her voice lowering. The autopsy revealed a fracture to the back of Daniel's skull, not consistent with falling forward onto the workbench. I frowned. What are you saying? The medical examiner believes he was struck from behind with a heavy object. Not pushed as Elliot claimed. The implications were staggering. Elliot lied? Even at the end? Rebecca nodded grimly. The police found an old boat anchor in the shed, hidden beneath some rotting floorboards. They think that was the murder weapon. So Elliot didn't push him during a fight, I said slowly. He deliberately struck him from behind. It seems that way. Premeditated murder, not a heat-of-the-moment accident. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. We helped cover up a cold-blooded killing, Nick. Not an accident, a murder. The door opened, and the officer returned. Time's up. Ms. Chin needs to return to her cell, and Mr. Adler, your attorney, wants to speak with you before processing. Rebecca stood, then hesitated. Nick, despite everything, I'm glad the truth is finally out. Living with this secret, it was destroying all of us from the inside. I nodded. Me too. As she was led away, I realized she was right. The letters that had arrived at my door a week ago, they had torn apart my life, exposed my darkest secret, and ensured I would spend years in prison. But they had also freed me from a prison of my own making, the prison of guilt and lies that had defined my existence for 20 years. 2 days later, I was permitted a supervised visit to the local newspaper office, where I provided a full statement about what had happened at Lake Everett, both 20 years ago and during our recent confrontation with Catherine. The journalist who interviewed me, a compassionate woman in her 50s, asked one final question as our time was ending. The anonymous letters that started all this, do you have any idea who sent them? Was it Catherine Whitaker? I shook my head. Catherine denied sending them. She said her investigation into Daniel's death only began after she was contacted by Marcus 3 weeks earlier. The letters came from someone else. Who could it have been? I thought about this question often in the quiet hours of my cell. The letters that had arrived at my door, typed on cream-colored stationery in courier font, who had sent them? Who had known enough to set this long-delayed justice in motion? I don't know, I admitted. But whoever it was, I think they knew that the truth needed to come out. For Daniel's sake. For his family. And maybe even for ours. As I was escorted back to the detention center, I thought about the strange path that had led me here. How a few anonymous letters had unraveled 20 years of careful deception. How secrets buried as deeply as Daniel's body had still found their way to the surface. The first construction crews were returning to Lake Everett as we drove past. Work had been temporarily halted during the police investigation but was now resuming. The lake would be reshaped, the shore redeveloped, the boat shed demolished. But the truth of what had happened there could never be hidden again. 1 week later, a final letter arrived for me at the detention center. Unlike the others, this one had a return address, the Whitaker family home. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten message from Daniel's mother. In Judaism, there is a concept called teshuvah, the act of repenting and returning to the right path. True teshuvah requires confession, genuine remorse, and a commitment to a different way of living. I do not forgive you for your part in concealing what happened to my son. That is not mine to give. But I recognize your teshuvah has begun with your confession and cooperation with the authorities. The truth, however painful, has finally allowed us to lay our son to rest properly. The anonymous letters that led to this resolution came from Daniel's high school English teacher, Mrs. Harmon. Before he died, Daniel had written an essay for our class about friendship and betrayal. In it, he expressed fears about what Marcus and Elliot were involved in. When she saw the news about the lake being drained, she connected the dots and decided it was time for the truth to emerge. Sometimes justice arrives in unexpected ways, from unexpected sources. May you find some measure of peace in the truth, as we are attempting to do. I folded the letter carefully and placed it under my thin detention center pillow. There would be a trial, sentencing, years of incarceration ahead. My former life was gone forever. But for the first time in 20 years, I would sleep without the crushing weight of secrets. The unknown mail had delivered its final message that no matter how deeply we bury the truth, it waits patiently to be discovered. And when it emerges, it brings both destruction and, paradoxically, liberation. For 2 decades, I had been running from what happened at Lake Everett. Now, finally, I had stopped running. Whatever lay ahead, I would face it with the clarity that only the truth can bring. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.